I never thought adopting a cat would turn my life into a low-budget supernatural comedy. But here we are. It started innocently enough, a rescue shelter, a sleek black cat with impossibly green eyes, and the promise of companionship. The moment I opened the carrier, Nimbus, the name I decided on after much internal debate, stepped out with the kind of regal calm usually reserved for monarchs or, say, particularly demanding barristers. He didn't blink, or at least not in the way any normal cat would. His eyes stayed wide open, unblinking, like two emerald lanterns fixed on me, measuring me, judging me, or possibly plotting world domination. I half expected him to mutter some ancient curse or summon a thunderstorm, but all he did was sit down neatly, tail wrapped around his paws, and look utterly unimpressed. The house felt different with him in it. The air seemed charged, like just before a summer storm, even though the sky outside was clear and blue. I shivered, wrapping my arms around myself, and Nimbus's eyes flicked to the window, unblinking. It was like he controlled the weather, or at least wanted me to think he did. That first night, after a dinner of something suspiciously fancy that I'd bought, because I was trying to impress my new roommate, I settled on the couch with a book. Nimbus was perched on the windowsill, silent and still. As the clock ticked past midnight, I started to hear its soft, almost imperceptible murmurs. At first, I thought I was dreaming or maybe the house settling, but then I caught it, a string of words, unmistakably Latin, Fortuna Favit. I blinked, looking around. Nimbus's mouth barely moved, but the sounds were there. I wasn't going crazy, was I? I pinched myself and got a sharp sting. Nope, awake. The cat was muttering Latin. I suppose if I had to have a supernatural cat, a Latin-speaking one was at least somewhat dignified. The next morning, I tried to tell a friend about my new roommate, but the words came out all tangled. He's different, I said. He doesn't blink. He might control the weather, and he talks in Latin. She laughed, thinking I was joking. I wasn't. Nimbus sat on the armrest, watching me with those unblinking eyes, utterly unfazed by my ramblings. I was pretty sure he was amused. Over the next few days, minor anomalies started to appear. The air in the room would grow inexplicably cold when Nimbus jumped onto the sofa. A gentle breeze would stir the curtains, even though all the windows were shut tight. I began to suspect that Nimbus wasn't just a cat, but some kind of feline weather wizard or miniature deity in fur. I caught myself talking to him as if he understood. "Nimbus, please don't summon a thunderstorm in the living room," I'd joke. He'd stare back, eyes unwavering, and I swear I heard a faint purr that sounded suspiciously like a chuckle. Despite the oddness, there was something comforting about the routine. I was no longer alone in my quiet suburban life. I had Nimbus, the cat that never blinks, and whatever strange power he wielded. Little did I know, this was only the beginning of the chaos and comedy that would soon follow. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the softest whisper again, a phrase I'd soon come to recognize as one of Nimbus's favorite Latin incantations. I smiled despite myself. This was going to be one hell of a ride. And as Nimbus's green eyes glowed in the dark, unblinking and inscrutable, I realized that adopting a cat was the best decision I'd ever made, if only because it guaranteed my life would never be boring again. I never thought adopting a cat could be so theatrical. When I brought Nimbus home, I expected the usual, a few knocked-over plants, a disdainful glare, maybe some late-night yodeling. What I got instead was an escalating series of inexplicable events that made me question if I'd accidentally signed up to live with a furry weather deity. It started with the temperature. One afternoon, as Nimbus perched on the windowsill, eyes fixed and unblinking, I noticed a sudden chill sweep the room. I glanced at the thermostat, set to a cozy 72 degrees, yet the air around me felt like I'd stepped into a wind tunnel. I rubbed my arms, shivering, while Nimbus remained utterly serene, his sleek black fur barely ruffled, and those green eyes glowed with an unsettling calm. "You were cold," I muttered, half to myself, half to the cat. Nimbus blinked slowly, as if amused by my discomfort. Trying to rationalize, I checked the windows closed tight. No drafts, no broken seals. The heater hummed along dutifully, oblivious to my sudden goosebumps. I poured myself a cup of tea, hoping the warmth would chase the chill away, but the room had other plans. Then came the breeze. It was subtle at first, a faint flutter of the curtains, a gentle rustling of papers on my desk. I looked around, half expecting a window to be open or a vent to be blasting air. Nothing. The breeze grew stronger, enough to flip the pages of my notebook, scattering notes like confetti. Nimbus remained unmoved, tail flicking lazily as if he commanded the wind itself. "Nimbus," I said, lowering my voice to a conspiratorial whisper, "are you doing this?" He responded with an unblinking stare that sent a shiver down my spine, though I wasn't sure if it was from the cold or the intensity of his gaze. Determined to get to the bottom of this, I began documenting the phenomena. I jotted down times, temperatures, and descriptions of the breezes. Every time Nimbus was in the room, strange things happened. Every time he left, the atmosphere returned to normal. It was like living with a tiny, furry storm cloud with a penchant for mischief. Of course, life with Nimbus wasn't all supernatural chills and mysterious gusts. There was the usual cat business, knocking over a potted plant or two, weaving between my legs at inopportune moments, and the occasional disdainful meow that suggested I was failing as a human servant. One particularly memorable incident involved Nimbus batting a fern off the coffee table with the precision of a seasoned prankster. The plant crashed to the floor, soil scattering like a miniature mudslide. I sighed, dropping my pen. "Really?" I muttered. Trying to keep things light, I talked to Nimbus as if he were an equal partner in this weather-wielding conspiracy. "Come on, Nimbus," I pleaded one evening. "Tell me what you want. Is this some sort of feline protest?" He blinked slowly, a deliberate, measured gesture that felt less like a blink and more like a challenge. I swear, in that moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Days blurred together in a haze of odd temperatures and inexplicable breezes. My attempts to maintain a normal routine were constantly thwarted by Nimbus's antics. I'd be typing an email when suddenly a gust would scatter my papers. I'd be enjoying a quiet coffee when the room would shift from warm to cold in a heartbeat. Friends who visited looked at me with a mixture of concern and amusement, unsure whether to believe my stories or chalk them up to stress. At night, Nimbus claimed his throne on the windowsill, eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. I'd catch him muttering low, guttural sounds, something that, with a stretch of imagination, sounded vaguely like Latin. I wasn't sure if it was a comforting incantation or a feline curse aimed at me. Despite the chaos, I found myself growing strangely fond of this unblinking creature. There was a bizarre comfort in the unpredictability, a twisted companionship in the shared confusion. Nimbus was no ordinary cat, and I was no ordinary pet owner. Together we were navigating this surreal new reality, one chilly breeze and mysterious murmur at a time. And so, the first signs of chaos had firmly taken root in my suburban sanctuary. Little did I know, this was only the beginning of a far stranger tale. Nimbus wasn't just a pet. He was a force of nature with a flair for the dramatic. And I was caught in the eye of the storm. As I settled onto the couch, notebook in hand, ready to chronicle the latest strange occurrence, Nimbus jumped onto my lap, purring softly. His green eyes locked onto mine, unblinking and unreadable. I smiled nervously. "All right, Nimbus," I said, "what's next?" The breeze picked up again, fluttering the pages, and I braced myself for whatever absurdity was coming next. I was sitting on the couch, sipping my third cup of lukewarm coffee, when I first heard it, the faintest murmur of words that couldn't possibly be English. At first, I thought it was the wind playing tricks on me, or perhaps the VES subtitles bleeding into my imagination. But then, there it was again, clearer this time, soft, deliberate, and unmistakably vocalized. "Tempus fugit," whispered Nimbus, sitting regally atop the windowsill as if he owned the very storm brewing outside. His fur gleamed black against the dim light, and those unblinking green eyes locked onto mine with an unsettling intelligence that sent a shiver down my spine. "Did you just speak Latin?" I asked, half expecting a cat to ignore me, but Nimbus remained statuesque, his mouth barely moving as he repeated, "Tempus fugit." My heart raced. For a moment, I wondered if sleep deprivation was finally getting the better of me, or if Nimbus was some kind of supernatural enigma. I grabbed my laptop and frantically typed "Tempus fugit," revealing the phrase meant "time flies." "Well, that's ominous," I muttered, eyes darting back to Nimbus, who seemed to smirk if cats could smirk. Over the next few days, the whispers grew more frequent. Nimbus muttered phrases like "Aquila non capit muscas" and "Fortuna audaces juvat," each uttered with a calm authority that made me both fascinated and deeply unnerved. I started jotting down every phrase, cross-referencing online Latin dictionaries, and trying to decipher any message hidden in these cryptic utterances. But my attempts to communicate back were less than successful. In desperation, I turned to the internet for guidance on ritualistic communication, cobbling together a ridiculous ceremony involving a circle of salt. Some incense I found buried in a drawer, and my best Latin pronunciations. "O mighty Nimbus," I intoned, "regnum tuum pate faciat," which I hoped meant something like "reveal your kingdom." Nimbus just blinked slowly, or rather, didn't blink at all, and settled deeper into his throne-like perch on the windowsill. The room hung heavy with incense smoke, and the faint hum of thunder outside seemed to respond to my clumsy invocation. Suddenly, a gust of wind swept through the room, scattering my notes like startled birds and flickering the lights. I froze, heart pounding, eyes locked on Nimbus, who yawned lazily and stretched with the grace of a small, dark emperor. Was this some kind of approval, or a cosmic joke at my expense? Despite the absurdity, I couldn't help but feel drawn deeper into this strange dance between pet and master, language and silence, chaos and order. Nimbus wasn't just a cat. He was a puzzle wrapped in fur, speaking riddles in a tongue long dead, demanding rituals that made me question my sanity and, oddly enough, brought a peculiar comfort amidst the bewilderment. Each night, as Nimbus whispered his Latin lullabies, I found myself both terrified and enchanted, caught in a bizarre worship of a creature who ruled not just the house, but the very air and sky around us. Perhaps, I thought, this was the companionship I had been searching for: a little madness, a little magic, and a whole lot of unblinking green eyes watching over me. As I lay in bed that night, the faint echoes of Latin phrases mingling with the distant rumble of thunder, I realized this was only. Nimbus had secrets to share, and I was foolish enough or brave enough to listen. The moment I stepped through the threshold of my living room, an eerie sensation prickled at the back of my neck. The usual suburban calm was shattered not by a barking dog or blaring lawnmower, but by something far more unsettling. My curtains fluttered wildly despite the closed windows, and a cool breeze, inexplicably confined to the room, rustled the pages of a forgotten magazine on the coffee table. I blinked, unsure if the exhaustion was playing tricks on me. Then, as if summoned by my disbelief, raindrops began to fall not from the sky, but from the ceiling itself. Nimbus sat perfectly still in the center of the room, his sleek black fur untouched by the moisture, his piercing green eyes unblinking and fixed on me with an inscrutable gaze. I wanted to call out to him, to ask what madness this was, but my voice caught in my throat. Instead, I stood frozen, watching as the indoor storm grew more intense. The soft patter of rain became a drumming cascade, and then, with a sudden crack that made me jump, thunder roared inside my house. I darted for the nearest electrical outlet, yanking out the plugs of my laptop and lamps in a frantic bid to prevent disaster. Lightning flickered behind the windows, illuminating the room in stark, erratic bursts. The air smelled of ozone and damp wood, a scent so vivid I could almost convince myself I was outside. Nimbus remained unmoved, his tail flicking lazily as if he were merely indulging in a parlor trick. I couldn't decide whether to be terrified or impressed. "Nimbus," I stammered, "what in the name of all that is unholy are you doing? The cat's gaze didn't waver. Then, almost imperceptibly, I caught the faintest murmur, a whisper of a phrase in crisp Latin, so soft I had to strain to hear it over the storm's fury. I shook my head. This was beyond anything I'd imagined when I signed up for a rescue cat. I'd expected claw marks and fur tumbleweeds, not indoor thunderstorms and ancient incantations. Desperation pushed me to try something, anything to regain control. I scrambled to gather cushions, towels, anything to soak up the rain before it ruined my floorboards. As I worked, the thunder softened, the lightning dimmed, and the rain slowed to a gentle drizzle. Nimbus jumped down from his perch and padded over to me, brushing his head against my ankle with an unexpected softness that sent a confusing wave of warmth through my bewildered heart. The storm outside quieted as abruptly as it had begun, leaving behind a fresh, earthy scent that filled the room with a strange sense of calm. I sank to the floor, drenched and exhausted but oddly exhilarated. Here I was, a man who'd only wanted a companion to keep loneliness at bay, now living with a cat who could summon storms and speak in tongues long dead. "Okay," I whispered, wiping rain from my sleeve. "You win, Nimbus. But can we maybe keep the weather outside next time?" The cat blinked no, he did not blink, but his eyes gleamed with what I could only interpret as amusement. Or maybe that was just my imagination. Either way, life had become far more interesting and infinitely more chaotic than I'd ever bargained for. And as I looked at Nimbus, the cat that never blinks, I realized that I was in for a wild ride, whether I liked it or not. The storm had passed, but the question lingered, what else was Nimbus capable of? And more importantly, what did he want from me? If you had told me a week ago that my evenings would be spent on the living room floor, performing a bizarre worship ritual to a cat, I probably would have laughed until I cried. Now, as I knelt awkwardly clutching a half-melted candle in one hand and a plastic incense stick bought from an ironically named shop called Mystic Oddities in the other, I wasn't laughing. I was trying, desperately, to make sense of the chaos Nimbus had unleashed in my life. To say Nimbus demanded attention would be an understatement. The sleek black feline, with his unblinking emerald eyes that seemed to bore into my very soul, had quickly established himself not just as a pet, but as an enigmatic sovereign of my household. And like any sovereign, he demanded ritualistic reverence. At least, that was the conclusion I'd come to after a particularly wild night involving a thunderstorm inside my kitchen, a shattered vase, and Nimbus's unusually vocal Latin muttering. The ritual was born out of desperation and a dash of unhinged logic. If Nimbus was some sort of weather-controlling, Latin-speaking feline deity, then surely appeasing him with offerings and chants might keep the storms at bay or at least reduce the indoor thunderclaps. My research had been minimal. Mostly Google searches for cat worship rituals and Latin phrases for weather control, which mostly yielded medieval grimoires and a lot of confused Reddit threads. So here I was, crouched on the shaggy rug, trying to look serious while reciting nonsense phrases I'd cobbled together from an online Latin translator. Ventus pacem, Nimbus Dominus, I muttered, hoping it meant something like wind peace, Lord Nimbus. The candle flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and the incense stick emitted a faint, oddly synthetic lavender scent. Nimbus sat regally on his throne, the windowsill, watching me with an expression that was both judgmental and mildly amused. His eyes never blinked, not even once, their unyielding gaze making the room feel charged, as if I were a supplicant before an ancient and inscrutable god. I paused and glanced up, half expecting him to speak in Latin again or summon a miniature storm cloud. Instead, he simply flicked his tail with slow, deliberate grace. It was during this tense silence that I noticed the curtains fluttering, despite the windows being firmly shut. A gentle breeze stirred the fabric, carrying with it a whisper of cool air. My heart leapt. Was this coincidence or evidence that my ridiculous ritual had some small power? I wasn't sure if I was relieved or terrified. "Nimbus," I whispered, barely daring to breathe. "Did you like that?" The cat's response was an imperceptible twitch of whiskers and a slow blink. Well, okay, maybe just a very brief narrowing of his eyes, but it was close enough. Encouraged, I continued the chant, each word feeling more absurd than the last but somehow more sincere. My neighbors probably thought I'd lost it. Kneeling on the floor, talking to my cat like he was a capricious weather god, waving candles and incense around like some low-budget cultist. But the calming breeze and the slight drop in temperature told me that maybe, just maybe, there was something to this madness. Later that evening, I attempted to replicate the ritual. This time, I added a dubious offering of catnip, a peace offering, if you will, placing it carefully on a saucer beside Nimbus's favorite cushion. Nimbus sniffed it, gave a dismissive flick of his tail, and promptly ignored the whole setup to groom himself. The ritual fell flat. No breeze, no calming temperature shift, just an unimpressed cat and a very awkward me. I slumped onto the couch, laughing nervously at the absurdity of it all. Nimbus, in a rare show of affection, or perhaps condescension, curled up beside me, purring softly. His unblinking eyes softened just a fraction, and for a moment, the chaos seemed manageable. Maybe he didn't expect perfection. Maybe he just wanted me to try. Or maybe I was just making it all up to keep my sanity. Either way, I was hooked. The rituals would continue. The worship would grow stranger. And I would keep trying to make sense of the cat that never blinks, the feline deity of my suburban chaos. Because if life with Nimbus had taught me one thing so far, it was this: sometimes when the world makes no sense, you just have to light a candle, mumble some Latin, and hope the wind listens. And with that thought, I lit the candle again, ready for another round of absurd devotion. I remember the day I realized I couldn't handle Nimbus alone. Not because he'd shredded the curtains again, though. He had, spectacularly, with the kind of precision that suggested he was aiming for some arcane feline pattern, but because the house felt less like a home and more like an enchanted weather station run by a cat with a penchant for Latin incantations. That's when I called Maggie. Maggie answered on the third ring, her voice carrying that perfect blend of curiosity and skepticism that only a lifelong friend could muster. "You're calling me because your cat is summoning storms now, aren't you?" she said deadpan. I laughed nervously, clutching my battered notebook filled with scribbled observations. "It's not just storms. Nimbus, he mutters Latin. I think he's demanding worship." "Of course he is," Maggie replied, her tone thick with sarcasm. "Because if you were going to have a cat, why not have a pet deity while you re-at it?" I found myself at her place within the hour, the notebook clutched like a lifeline. Maggie's kitchen was a comforting jumble of mismatched mugs and a faint smell of burnt toast. She greeted me with a raised eyebrow and a steaming cup of coffee. "All right," she said, flipping open my notebook and scanning the pages. "So the cat speaks Latin, controls the weather, and expects you to worship him. How exactly did you get roped into this?" "I didn't," I said, sinking into a chair. "He chose me. Or maybe I chose him. Either way, I'm stuck." Maggie chuckled. "Sounds like a typical Tuesday." As I recounted the latest events, the indoor thunderstorm last week, the inexplicable temperature drops, and the odd Latin phrases I caught Nimbus muttering, when he thought I wasn't listening, Maggie listened with a mix of amusement and disbelief. Then she offered what I desperately needed, a dose of dry, pragmatic advice. "Look," she said, "you can either go full cult leader and start building altars to the cat, or you can treat him like a cat who's having a bit of an existential crisis." I laughed, but inside, I wasn't sure which path I was on. Maggie's humor was a balm grounding me when I felt the edges of reality blur. Then, as if on cue, a gust of wind swept through the kitchen, ruffling the curtains despite the windows being firmly shut. Maggie glanced over, unimpressed. "Well, there goes the neighborhood," she muttered. I scribbled furiously in my notebook, half expecting Nimbus to smirk at the spectacle. "You need to stop overthinking," Maggie said firmly, her voice softening. or you will end up talking to Nimbus like he actually answers back. I glanced behind me. Nimbus sat on the windowsill, his unblinking green eyes fixed on us with an inscrutable expression that might have been amusement or disdain or both. "Maybe he does," I whispered. "Maybe," Maggie said, raising her coffee cup in a mock toast. "But until then, try to stay sane, okay?" I nodded, feeling the weight of her friendship and the absurd, wonderful chaos that was now my life. As I left her house, I realized that while Nimbus controlled the weather, Maggie controlled my sanity, and for now, that was enough. The real challenge was just beginning, but with Maggie's perspective, I might just survive the storm. The next morning, I awoke to the soft patter of rain against the window. Nimbus was perched on the armrest of my chair, eyes wide and unblinking as always. I rubbed my temples and reached for my notebook, already anticipating another day of bizarre phenomena. But now I wasn't alone. I had Maggie's voice in my head reminding me to breathe, to laugh, and maybe, just maybe, to accept the ridiculousness of worshipping a cat who might be a weather-controlling, Latin-speaking enigma. Because in the end, isn't that what companionship is? Finding someone or some cat to weather the storms with you, no matter how strange they get. And with Nimbus, the storms were just getting started. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the doorbell rang, a sharp chime cutting through the usual suburban hum of lawnmowers and distant barking dogs. I shuffled to the door, still half distracted by the lingering scent of damp laundry and the faint whiff of Nimbus' omnipresent catnip. Opening the door, I was met with the sight of Mir. Jenkins, notebook in hand, wild eyes shining behind his thick glasses. An expression that suggested had just discovered the meaning of life, or at least the secret to Nimbus's strange powers. "Ah, just the man I wanted to see!" he exclaimed, stepping inside with the confidence of someone who had cracked a code only he could understand. "Nimbus, you say?"
"The cat! Fascinating creature!"
I blinked, unsure if I was about to be enlightened or further plunged into madness. "Yes, Nimbus." "Why?" Mr. Jenkins wasted no time. He pulled out a crumpled page from his notebook, covered in sketches of clouds, lightning bolts, and what looked suspiciously like a cat with a lightning bolt tail. "I've been tracking weather anomalies in this neighborhood for years," he began, voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But since Nimbus arrived, localized shifts in weather fog, sudden gusts, even that indoor thunderstorm coincide perfectly with his presence." Nimbus, true to form, sat atop the windowsill, tail twitching, emerald eyes fixed on Jenkins with an unblinking stare that somehow made the whole room feel colder. "I call it the feline atmospheric influence theory," Jenkins continued, waving his hand as if conducting an invisible orchestra of storms. "There's precedent for this in ancient mythologies, cats as guardians of the weather, mediators of the skies." I half smiled, partly in disbelief and partly because the whole thing was so absurd it could have come from a Terry Pratchett novel. "So you think Nimbus is some kind of weather god trapped in a cat's body?"
"Exactly!"
"And those Latin murmurs, arcane incantations?"
"His communicating, controlling."
Before I could respond, Maggie appeared in the doorway, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. She took in the scene, me looking exhausted, Jenkins looking like he'd just found his life's purpose, and Nimbus, the inscrutable feline monarch. "Should I be worried, or is this a new episode of suburban surrealism?" she quipped dryly, handing me a cup. Jenkins beamed as if Maggie's sarcasm was the highest form of praise. Listen to her, the voice of reason amid the storm. Nimbus yawned, revealing a perfect set of tiny teeth, utterly indifferent to the human chaos swirling around him. The afternoon wore on with Jenkins detailing his theories, showing me weather charts annotated with cat paw prints and ancient symbols. Maggie occasionally interjected with sharp-witted remarks, grounding the conversation as I oscillated between skepticism and a strange, growing intrigue. At one point, Jenkins pulled out an old book from his bag, pages yellowed and dog-eared, filled with illustrations of mythical creatures and weather gods. "See here," he said, pointing to a figure strikingly similar to Nimbus. The Nimbus Phyllis, a guardian of storms, revered in forgotten cultures. I glanced at Nimbus, who was now perched like a small black statue on the bookshelf. His unblinking gaze seemed to pierce through the layers of disbelief I was trying to maintain. Was it possible that amidst the absurdity, there was a sliver of truth? If this is true, I said slowly, then what do I do? How do I live with a cat that might be controlling the weather and speaking Latin? Jenkins grinned, notebook poised for more scribbles. You negotiate, my friend. You learn the language of storms and cats. You become the worshipper he demands. Maggie snorted. Or you just get a really good umbrella and hope for the best. Nimbus blinked once finally, after what felt like an eternity, and stretched luxuriously, as if he were utterly pleased with how the meeting had gone. As Jenkins packed up his notes, promising to return with more revelations, I stood by the door, coffee warming my hands, heart oddly fluttering between amusement and a creeping sense of awe. Could Nimbus really be something more? Or had I finally crossed the line from pet owner to bemused believer in the bizarre? Only time and perhaps more late-night Latin murmurs would tell. But one thing was certain: life with Nimbus was never going to be ordinary again. It started as a desperate experiment. After days of Nimbus ruling the house with his unblinking gaze and cryptic Latin mutterings, I was grasping at straws, or rather, at whatever might pry open the iron door of his inscrutable personality. That's when I remembered catnip, the old standby of cat owners everywhere, a simple herb that turned the most aloof feline into a rolling, purring puddle of joy. Surely, if anything could distract Nimbus, it would be catnip. I approached with cautious optimism, catnip sachet in hand and Nimbus perched on the windowsill, eyes like emerald lasers locked on me without a hint of blinking. He seemed to sense the ritual about to unfold, or perhaps he was merely humoring me, which, given his usual disdain, was a generous assumption. With a furtive glance to ensure the neighbors weren't spying through their curtains, I scattered a pinch of catnip on the living room carpet. Then the moment of truth I watched. At first, Nimbus sat still, the picture of regal composure, but then something subtle shifted. His tail twitched a slow, deliberate flick that spoke volumes in cat language. Next, he leapt down with the grace of a shadow dissolving into moonlight and landed squarely in the catnip patch. What happened next was nothing short of miraculous, or at least hilariously unexpected. Nimbus, the unblinking, weather-controlling enigma, abandoned his solemn throne and erupted into a frenzy of feline abandon. He rolled on his back, paws batting at the air like a tiny, furry sorcerer casting spells of chaos and delight. His green eyes, usually so sharp and commanding, sparkled with a mischievous glee that felt almost human. I couldn't help but laugh, a genuine, belly-deep laugh that shook the dust off my weary spirit. Here was Nimbus, the possibly supernatural cat, reduced to a writhing, purring heap of joy by a simple herb. The absurdity of it all was delicious. For a few blissful minutes, the house was transformed. The oppressive tension of weird weather shifts and ominous Latin whispers gave way to the lightness of a catnip-induced play session. Nimbus chased invisible foes, his tail flicking like a conductor's baton, orchestrating chaos in a way that felt oddly endearing. Then, in a sudden pause amid the frolic, Nimbus locked eyes with me. For a fleeting second, that unblinking stare softened, no longer the gaze of a meteorological overlord, but something almost affectionate, almost vulnerable. It was an unspoken truce, a moment of shared understanding across the vast gulf of our species and sanity. But as the effects of the catnip waned, the old Nimbus reasserted himself. He rose, shook his sleek black fur as if casting off an invisible spell, and returned to his silent vigil by the window. The temperature shifted ever so slightly, and a faint murmur of Latin drifted from his throat once more. I sat back on the couch, still chuckling, feeling the strange comfort of that brief interlude. Nimbus was undeniably a creature of chaos and mystery, but beneath it all, there were glimpses of something more. Maybe not quite ordinary, but definitely more than just a cat. And so, Armed with a newfound appreciation for the humble catnip, I resolved to keep experimenting. If nothing else, it was a reminder that even in a world turned upside down by supernatural cats and inexplicable weather, there was still room for laughter, for play, and for moments of unexpected connection. The adventure with Nimbus was far from over, but for now, the house felt a little lighter, and that was a victory worth savoring. As I watched Nimbus settle into a rare, contented purr, I wondered what other surprises this enigmatic cat had in store. Could the simplest things still disrupt the most complex of beings? Only time and plenty more catnip would tell. But one thing was certain: life with Nimbus was never dull, and neither was I. And just as I was starting to relax, I heard it again, that faint, unmistakable Latin whisper, echoing from the shadows, reminding me that the game was still very much afoot. Tempestus imminent, Nimbus seemed to say the storm is coming, and with that, the calm was over. The chaos was about to return. But for now, I had catnip. And that was enough. I had never thought a routine trip to the vet could feel like an expedition into the unknown. But then again, Nimbus was no ordinary cat. Clutching the sleek black feline in my arms, I walked into Jill's clinic with a mixture of hope and unease. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a clinical glow over the waiting room filled with the usual suspects: yipping dogs, curious kittens, and a rather disgruntled parrot that seemed to glare at Nimbus with suspicious intensity. Nimbus, however, was unfazed. His unblinking emerald eyes scanned the room with the calm of a monarch surveying his kingdom. I half expected him to issue some decree or summon a thunderstorm to silence the noisy animals, but he simply sat there, serene and aloof. Jill greeted me with her usual warm smile, though I could detect a flicker of concern beneath her professional facade. "So, what brings you and Nimbus in today?" she asked. Gesturing to the exam room, I hesitated, trying to find the right words that wouldn't sound completely absurd. "Well, it's complicated. Nimbus has been exhibiting some unusual behaviors. I thought a checkup might help." I trailed off, feeling the weight of my own skepticism. She nodded knowingly, as if she'd seen her fair share of eccentric pet owners. "Let's take a look, then." The exam room was bright and spotless, with posters of various animals decorating the walls. I carefully placed Nimbus on the examination table, half expecting him to leap down and disappear into some shadowy corner. Instead, he sat stiffly, his posture regal, his eyes never blinking. Jill approached cautiously, her hands gentle as she began her examination. She checked his ears, nose, and mouth, all the while muttering professional observations. "Good teeth, no signs of infection or inflammation," she said, making notes on her clipboard. Then came the moment of truth, the eye exam. Jill pulled out a small flashlight and shone it into Nimbus's eyes, expecting the usual feline contraction of pupils. But Nimbus's pupils remained fixed, unwavering, as if he were staring into an abyss, or perhaps the abyss was staring back. "That's unusual," Jill murmured, raising an eyebrow. Cats usually blink and their pupils respond to light. Nimbus, as if on cue, let out a low, almost imperceptible murmur. I leaned in, my heart pounding. It sounded like Latin, or at least something that wasn't English or any modern language I recognized. Jill's pen nearly slipped from her grasp. Did he just speak? "I think so," I whispered, caught between disbelief and fascination. She recovered quickly, though, and proceeded with the stethoscope. Placing it gently against Nimbus's chest, she listened intently. Heart rate is steady, strong. No murmurs or arrhythmias. Nimbus let out another soft phrase, again in that strange ancient tongue. Jill glanced up, her professional demeanor cracking into a smile tinged with amusement. "Well, that's a new one. Usually, the only language we hear here is barking or meowing." I laughed nervously. "Yeah, Nimbus isn't exactly your average cat." The rest of the examination continued with Jill running through standard tests, checking reflexes, temperature, and so on. Each time she asked a question or made a comment, Nimbus seemed to respond with a knowing stare, as if silently judging the proceedings. When the session ended, Jill shrugged, Physically, Nimbus is in perfect health. Behaviorally, though, well, we never met a cat quite like him. I nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and renewed mystery. Any ideas? Honestly, no. But I'd keep an eye on him and maybe keep a notebook. You never know with pets. Sometimes the strangest quirks turn out to be nothing, and other times, well. She trailed off, leaving the sentence hanging in the sterile air. I knew exactly what she meant. As we left the clinic, Nimbus settled back into my arms, his unblinking eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the horizon. I couldn't help but wonder just how deep this rabbit hole went. Maybe I was crazy. Or maybe Nimbus really was something more, something ancient, enigmatic, and endlessly amusing. Either way, the adventure was just beginning. The morning began like any other suburban Saturday, with the sun peeking through the curtains and casting a gentle glow over the quiet street. Birds chirped in the usual off-key symphony, and the scent of freshly cut grass wafted in from somewhere down the block. I had just poured myself a cup of coffee when the first signs of trouble made themselves known, not inside my house, but just outside the window. Tom's front lawn was drenched, not in the usual dew or lingering night moisture, but absolutely soaked, as if a small rain cloud had taken up permanent residence above his prized petunias. The rest of the neighborhood, basking in warm sunlight, looked on in confused silence. I rubbed my eyes, half convinced the caffeine hadn't kicked in yet. "Tom," I called, stepping out onto my porch, the soft creak of wooden floorboards punctuating the quiet. He stood there, arms crossed, drenched from shoulders to boots, eyes fixed upward in disbelief. "I don't get it," he muttered, voice tinged with frustration. "It's sunny everywhere else, but look at this!" He gestured helplessly to the soggy mess his garden had become. "My tomatoes are going to rot before they even get ripe." I shuffled over, clutching my umbrella uselessly as the drizzle continued unabated above Tom's yard. Nimbus might have had a hand in this, I admitted cautiously, glancing back toward my house where the sleek black silhouette of my cat sat motionless on the windowsill. His green eyes, unblinking and eerily steady, seemed to gleam with an almost imperceptible hint of amusement. Tom arched an eyebrow. "Your cat? Come on, man. That's a bit far-fetched, even for you." "I know it sounds crazy," I said, swatting at a stray drop of rain on my forehead, "but Nimbus isn't like any other cat. You remember the weird weather quirks IV mentioned? The sudden gusts, the temperature shifts. This feels like an extension of that." Tom sighed, shaking his head. "Well, if your mystical feline is raining on my parade, maybe you should do something about it." Before I could respond, a few neighbors emerged from their houses, drawn by the unusual localized rain and the spectacle of a soaked man complaining about the weather on a sunny day. Murmurs grew louder, eyes darted suspiciously toward my house, and I felt the heat of their curious, judgmental gazes. "Hey everyone," I called out, trying to sound casual despite the knot tightening in my stomach. "Nimbus isn't your average cat. It's complicated." Maggie, ever the pragmatic voice in my chaotic life, popped her head over the fence from her yard a few doors down. "Complicated. That's one way to put it," she said dryly with a smirk. "Looks like your cat's got the whole neighborhood talking." I glanced back at Nimbus, who remained seated like a dark sentinel, his gaze unwavering. I swear if cats could smirk, he'd be doing exactly that. The rain continued its steady fall over Tom's yard, droplets pattering rhythmically against the leaves and pooling in the flower beds. The smell of wet earth mingled with the faint scent of Nimbus's for an oddly comforting but surreal combination. It was as if the cat had conjured the storm just to remind us all who was really in charge. "I'm sorry about this, Tom," I said, shifting uncomfortably. "I'm trying to figure out how to keep Nimbus from turning the neighborhood into his personal weather lab." He gave me a wary look. "Just make sure he doesn't start a tornado next, all right?" I laughed, though it came out more like a nervous cough. No promises. As the neighbors slowly retreated back to their homes, whispers trailing like the fading raindrops, I realized that Nimbus's antics were no longer confined to our household. The suburban calm was cracking, revealing the absurd, chaotic undercurrent that Nimbus had brought into our lives. Back inside, I found Nimbus still perched on the windowsill, eyes locked on the dissipating rain cloud above Tom's yard. I knelt beside him, speaking softly. "You've got to give it a rest, Nimbus. We neighbors, not weather gods." He blinked once, an actual blink this time, and I could swear there was a hint of mischief in his gaze. The battle between normalcy and chaos was only just beginning, and I was already losing. But maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what I needed. Just as I was about to close the window, a sudden gust swirled through the room, scattering a few loose papers across the floor. Nimbus's tail flicked with calculated precision, and the faintest murmur of Latin passed his lips, too quiet to catch, but unmistakably there. "Great," I muttered, reaching for my notebook. Time to start documenting again. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, but I knew this calm was only temporary. Nimbus's weather was as unpredictable as his demands, and so was life with the cat that never blinks. Working from home was supposed to be a blessing. No commute, comfortable clothes, and the luxury of taking a break whenever the urge struck. But with Nimbus around, the concept of normal dissolved faster than my morning coffee, often literally. I settled into my usual spot by the window, laptop open, earbuds in, and a hopeful heart ready for productivity. The clock struck 9, and my first video call pinged. I smiled professionally at the screen, exchanged greetings, and began presenting my quarterly report. That's when it began. A sudden, inexplicable breeze wafted through the room, lifting scattered papers like miniature birds in flight. My hair stirred against my face. The light flickered. I glanced at Nimbus, who sat serenely on the armchair, his unblinking green eyes fixed on me, as if daring me to make sense of the chaos. A low rumble echoed softly, like distant thunder but indoors. "Excuse me," I muttered, trying to maintain composure. "Technical difficulties." My coworkers exchanged puzzled looks as the breeze intensified, carrying a faint scent of rain and damp earth. I scrambled to grab the fluttering papers, knocking over my coffee cup in the process. Dark liquid spread across my notes, ink bleeding into an abstract watercolor of failure. I might need to reschedule, I confessed, disconnecting before further disaster struck. Coffee, I decided, was non-negotiable. I shuffled to the kitchen, Nimbus silently trailing behind, his sleek black fur a stark contrast to the fluorescent light above. Filling the kettle, I tried to focus, but the whistle erupted in erratic bursts, a chaotic symphony to accompany my frazzled state. Nimbus's gaze never faltered, his eyes gleaming with inscrutable intent. Just as I reached for my notes again, a sudden draft billowed the curtains, and the steaming liquid spilled onto my papers once more. "Really?" I groaned. By mid-afternoon, Maggie arrived, her sharp eyes immediately assessing the disarray. "Looks like Nimbus is hosting a weather event," she quipped, stepping inside and surveying the scattered documents and half-empty coffee mugs. Her sarcasm was a balm to my frayed nerves, grounding me in the absurdity of the situation. Nimbus perched on the windowsill, watching the sunlight flicker through shifting clouds outside, perfectly at ease in the eye of his own storm. Maggie shook her head. "You need to stop trying to fight it. Just roll with the weirdness." I sighed, sinking onto the couch beside Nimbus, who curled up with an almost regal air. Outside, the street gleamed wet, then suddenly brightened as sunshine broke through the clouds, a subtle reminder that Nimbus's influence stretched beyond these walls. I rubbed my temples, exhausted but oddly comforted. Maybe acceptance was the key. Maybe, just maybe, working from home with a cat who controlled the weather would never be boring. And with that thought, I braced myself for whatever chaos Nimbus conjured next. Maggie's grin was the kind that suggested she was both amused and plotting something mischievous. I opened the door to find her standing there, holding a folded piece of paper like it was a fragile treasure. "Got something for you," she said, her voice the perfect blend of sarcasm and encouragement. "A date?" "Yes, really." I blinked. Not Nimbus style, the cat's unblinking stare was something else entirely, but just a regular human blink, confused and slightly panicked. A date. I echoed, glancing over my shoulder at the empty living room where Nimbus usually sat like a dark sentinel, eyes wide open, as if watching the very fabric of the universe. Maggie nodded. Yes, I figured you could use a break from worshipping your feline overlord. Plus, it's not like Nimbus has offered to set you up himself. I took the paper from her. It was an invitation to a small gathering at a friend's house, casual, nothing fancy, but enough to make me nervous. Okay, I admitted, but I'm warning you, Nimbus might have other plans. Maggie laughed. That's what makes it fun. That evening, I stood in front of the mirror adjusting my shirt for the umpteenth time. My reflection rumpled and anxious looked back at me, while Nimbus sat unmoving on the windowsill, his eyes locked on the darkening sky outside. The air in the room felt thick, charged like the calm before a storm. I caught him muttering something under his breath, Latin, of course, and I swear the temperature dropped a few degrees. I tried to ignore it. Tonight was supposed to be normal, at least as normal as life with Nimbus could get. Then it happened. A sudden gust of icy wind swept through the living room, scattering napkins from the coffee table and causing the candle flames to dance wildly. Nimbus's low chanting grew louder, a rhythmic cadence that sent shivers down my spine. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch and twist, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I scrambled to gather the scattered napkins, muttering apologies to my date who was due any minute now. "Nimbus, please," I whispered, "not tonight." But Nimbus didn't blink. Instead, he lipped down gracefully and settled in the middle of the room, his green eyes glowing faintly in the candlelight. The storm inside the house intensified, lightning flickers in the corner of my vision. Thunder rumbled softly, and the windows fogged up as if we were caught in a midsummer tempest. The doorbell rang. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door to reveal a woman standing there, umbrella in hand, eyes wide as she took in the minor indoor storm. Wow," she said, stepping inside cautiously. "Welcome to the Nimbus experience," I quipped, trying to keep my voice steady. She laughed, the sound warm and genuine despite the bizarre setting. "So, this is your cat?" "Yes," I said, "and no, he doesn't normally do this on dates." As the evening unfolded, Nimbus's antics continued, light flickers, strange murmurs, and occasional chilly breezes, but instead of driving my guest away, it sparked something unexpected. Laughter. Conversations about the absurdity of life, the mysteries of pets, and the unpredictable nature of companionship. By the time the date ended, the storm inside had calmed, and Nimbus was once again the silent, unblinking observer. I realized something important. Life with Nimbus was chaotic, yes, but it was also full of moments that defied explanation and brought people closer in the strangest ways. As I closed the door behind my guest, I caught Nimbus's gaze. For the first time, it felt less like a command and more like an invitation. Maybe, just maybe, I was beginning to understand what it meant to live under the reign of the cat that never blinks. And that was a beginning worth celebrating, storm or no storm. But just as I started to relax, a faint murmur of Latin whispered from the shadows, and the lights flickered once more. I sighed, smiled, and prepared for whatever absurdity was next, because with Nimbus, the night was never truly over. It started with a knock on the door that felt more like an ominous drumbeat than a friendly visit. I opened it to find Jenkins, notebook in hand, eyes gleaming with the kind of feverish intensity usually reserved for apocalyptic prophets or late-night infomercial hosts. "We need to talk," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "About Nimbus." I sighed, already knowing this conversation was heading nowhere good. "Mr. Jenkins, what now?" "The signs are everywhere," he declared, flipping open his notebook to reveal a chaotic mess of scribbles, weather maps, and what appeared to be hastily drawn arcane symbols. Localized thunderstorms, temperature anomalies, unblinking eyes that seemed to pierce the veil of reality itself. Nimbus isn't just a cat, he's a conduit, a harbinger. I blinked figuratively, since Nimbus never quite does at the mountain of absurdity before me. Or maybe he's just a cat with a knack for causing a little chaos. But Jenkins wasn't convinced. Over the next several days, his investigation morphed from quiet curiosity into a full-blown neighborhood campaign. He set up impromptu meetings in the park, complete with handouts titled Nimbus, the weather whisperer among us. I caught snippets of his impassioned speeches the storm last week.
Not a coincidence? Nimbus was there!
Neighbors listened, some with skeptical smiles, others with furrowed brows and glances toward my house. Maggie, ever the practical one, found the whole situation both hilarious and exasperating. One afternoon, she met me at the front door, coffee in hand and a smirk playing on her lips. You know, if Nimbus starts charging rent for all this attention, you're going to be broke. Tom, our perpetually confused next-door neighbor, lingered awkwardly nearby, glancing skyward, as if expecting Nimbus to summon lightning bolts on command. Maybe we should just stay indoors, he muttered, rubbing his neck nervously. Meanwhile, Nimbus remained inscrutable. Perched on his usual windowsill, his unblinking green eyes fixed on the gathering storm clouds that rolled in like an ominous curtain across the suburban skyline. It was as if he was both the cause and the calm within the chaos. One evening, unable to ignore the mounting tension, I sought out Meta. Jenkins in his backyard, a veritable shrine to meteorological obsession, cluttered with rain gauges, barometers, and stacks of yellowed newspapers. Jenkins, I began, trying to sound firm but fair. Don't you think you might be taking this a bit too far? He looked up, eyes shining with conviction. Far? No, my friend. I'm only just beginning to scratch the surface. Nimbus is the key to understanding the strange weather patterns we've been experiencing. If we ignore this, who knows what could happen? I rubbed my temples, caught between frustration and a grudging fascination. Here was a man convinced that my cat was the epicenter of an unfolding suburban supernatural event. And in the middle of it all stood Nimbus, serene and enigmatic, the cat that never blinks. As rumors swirled and neighbors whispered, I found myself wondering, was Nimbus truly the architect of this chaos? Or was it all just a delightful coincidence that allowed us to laugh at the absurdity of suburban life? Either way, my quiet existence was now a stage for the strangest show I'd ever witnessed, and there was no turning back. The chapter closed on a neighborhood meeting called by Jenkins, with a crowd growing larger and more curious by the minute. I stood beside Nimbus, who remained unmoved, his green eyes fixed on me as if daring me to believe the impossible. The storm was coming not just outside, but inside the fragile order of our little community. And I was right in the eye of it all. I never thought adopting a cat would lead me here talking to myself in Latin, pacing the living room like a mad scientist, and wondering if my sanity was just another casualty of Nimbus's reign. It had started innocuously enough. A few odd breezes in the house, a sudden chill in the air, the kind that made you glance over your shoulder, half expecting a ghost. But now, with notebooks sprawled around me filled with Latin phrases I barely understood, and rituals that felt more ridiculous by the minute, I was beginning to question everything, most of all, my own mind. Nimbus, as usual, sat perched on the windowsill, his sleek black fur contrasting sharply with the pale light filtering through the curtains. His green eyes, unblinking and piercing, seemed to weigh me with ancient knowledge, or perhaps just with the eternal patience cats reserve for their humans' nonsense. I swear sometimes those eyes flickered with something like amusement. Or was that just my wary brain playing tricks? Why me? I muttered, pacing back to the kitchen table, where a half-finished Latin dictionary lay open next to a mug of cold coffee. The words swam before my eyes, a jumble of syllables that I was supposed to use in some bizarre attempt to appease the feline overlord that now ran my life. My phone buzzed, jolting me from my spiral. Maggie's name lit up the screen. I snatched it up, hopeful for a lifeline to sanity. "Hey Maggie," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hey," she replied, voice calm, but with that unmistakable edge of sarcasm that always made me feel simultaneously understood and exasperated. "So, what's the latest?" "Nimbus casting spells now. I'm serious," I insisted, lowering my voice as if Nimbus might hear. "Last night I caught him muttering Latin under his breath. I looked it up, some kind of invocation. And the weather, the storm the other day. I'm convinced he's causing it." "Well," Maggie said, "if your cat starts levitating, call me. Until then, maybe try not to lose your mind." I laughed, though it felt hollow. Maggie's groundedness was the anchor I clung to, even as the tides of absurdity threatened to pull me under. Later that evening, emboldened by a few hours of calm, I decided to try another ritual. I cleared the kitchen table, lit a candle, and began chanting the Latin phrases I'd painstakingly pieced together. Nimbus watched from the corner, eyes unblinking, his tail flicking with what I could only interpret as disdain. As I spoke the last words, a sudden gust of wind swept through the room, scattering papers and blowing out the candle. I stood frozen, heart pounding, caught between triumph and terror. "Okay," I whispered, "you win." But did I? That night's sleep eluded me. I lay in bed staring at Nimbus, who had gracefully claimed his usual spot at the foot of the mattress. His green eyes reflected the moonlight, unblinking, inscrutable. In that silence, I realized that the line between madness and belief was thinner than I ever imagined. Was I losing my mind? Or was Nimbus truly something beyond comprehension? The absurdity of worshipping a cat who controlled the weather and spoke ancient languages was not lost on me. Yet, in some twisted way, it was the only thing that made sense. The next morning, I found myself smiling despite the chaos. Maybe embracing the madness was the only sane thing left to do. So, with a deep breath and a shaky resolve, I prepared for whatever Nimbus had next in store, because one thing was certain. Life with a cat that never blinks was never going to be normal. And honestly, I was starting to like it. But just as I was settling into this uneasy acceptance, a strange sound caught my attention, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper emanating from Nimbus, as if he were about to remind me that the story was far from over. It was one of those nights when the air in the house felt thick, like the atmosphere itself was holding its breath. I sat cross-legged on the living room floor, a fortress of open Latin dictionaries and notebooks sprawled around me like the aftermath of some academic tornado. Nimbus, as regal and inscrutable as ever, perched silently on the windowsill, his unblinking green eyes fixed on me with the kind of expression that suggested he knew exactly what I was trying to do and was thoroughly entertained by my fumbling efforts. For days I had been transcribing the strange Latin phrases Nimbus muttered in his low, almost imperceptible voice. Each phrase was a puzzle piece in a cryptic mosaic I was desperate to understand. Tonight, fueled by a mixture of caffeine and desperation, I finally managed to connect the dots. "Tempestas dominus est," I whispered cautiously, testing the phrase on my tongue. "The storm is master," or "the master of the storm." Nimbus blinked. Or rather, he didn't blink, his eyes remained fixed, unyielding. But there was a subtle shift, a twitch in his whiskers that I chose to interpret as acknowledgement. The room seemed to respond. A sudden gust of wind swept through the open window, rattling the curtains and scattering the pages of my dictionaries. The overhead light flickered, casting dancing shadows that made Nimbus's sleek black for shimmer like a dark constellation. I shivered, half from the chill, half from the thrill of what was unfolding. Was this all coincidence? Of course. But the timing was spectacular. Inspired, I decided to go all in. If Nimbus wanted worship, then worship he would have, albeit in my own awkward, suburban way. I cleared a small space on the floor and arranged a curious altar, a bowl of his favorite cat treats, a handful of incense sticks, and a small candle I borrowed from the kitchen. I even dug out an old chant I found online, cobbled together from my Latin phrase, and some cheerful YouTube tutorials on medieval rituals. "Tempestas dominus est," I intoned, voice wobbling as I waved my hands in what I hoped looked like meaningful gestures. Nimbus observed the spectacle with an air of mild amusement, tail flicking in slow approval. At one point, he let out a low purr, which I took as a sign that I wasn't entirely off the mark. The incense smoke curled upward, carrying my hopes with it, and the candle's flickering light cast long shadows that danced along the walls. Outside, the usual suburban night sounds seemed to pause. The distant bark of a dog, the rustle of leaves, even the hum of passing cars faded into a strange quiet. Then, as if on cue, the chaotic weather anomalies that had plagued the house all week held their breath. The sudden indoor thunderstorm that had drenched my kitchen the day before was conspicuously absent tonight. The inexplicable breezes that had chilled me at odd moments had ceased. Nimbus's realm seemed momentarily stable. I exhaled, a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Had I truly communicated something to Nimbus? Or was this just another twist in the bizarre comedy that had become my life? Nimbus stretched lazily, the picture of feline indifference, but I caught a glint of something in his eyes, a spark of connection, maybe, or just amusement at my foolishness. Either way, I felt a strange surge of hope that this was a beginning rather than an end. As I blew out the candle, the smoke drifting into the ceiling, I knew one thing for sure. Living with Nimbus was no longer just about surviving the chaos. It was about embracing the mystery, one absurd ritual at a time, and somewhere deep inside, I was ready for whatever came next. But what exactly did Tempestus Dominus Est mean for the storm brewing not just outside, but inside my very home? That was a question I'd be chasing for a long time to come. It started with a flicker of the lights, a subtle shift in the air that prickled at the back of my neck like the moment just before a sneeze. Nimbus, as usual, perched himself on the windowsill, his sleek black fur absorbing the fading sunlight, his green eyes wide and unblinking, glowing faintly in the dimming room. I was halfway through wiping down the kitchen counter when the first low rumble of thunder rolled through the house, not outside, mind you, but inside. I froze. The refrigerator hummed nervously. The ceiling fan slowed to a sluggish drone. Nimbus's gaze never wavered. Then came the flash, a sharp, jagged streak of lightning danced across the living room ceiling, illuminating the walls in stark white for a split second. I blinked, sure I was hallucinating, but no, the storm was happening inside my house. Nimbus. What the hell? I whispered, inching forward, the plastic spray bottle in my hand, suddenly feeling woefully inadequate. The cat didn't move, his tail flicking slowly as another rumble of thunder shook the walls. The rain started next, fat drops splattering onto the hardwood floor. The windows, the furniture, the whole living room was becoming a tempest chamber. I grabbed a nearby towel, desperately trying to shield the couch cushions from the soaking. Water pooled on the floor, and I slipped once, arms flailing like a windmill in a hurricane. Great, I muttered, now I'm a slapstick comedy act. Nimbus watched from his throne, as if he were the ruler of a storm god's domain, his green eyes unblinking and commanding. Occasionally, he muttered under his breath, a string of Latin phrases that I couldn't quite catch, but which sounded like ancient incantations. It was the kind of thing that would make any sane person question their reality, but I was already well past sanity's border. "All right," I said, squelching forward, soaked socks squishing against the floorboards. "I see your little weather trick. How about you stop before my carpet turns into a swimming pool?" No response, aside from a slow blink that felt more like a challenge. I realized then that negotiating with Nimbus would be like bargaining with a particularly stubborn deity, who also happened to be a cat that never blinked. I tried to reason, waving my arms in some sort of ridiculous gesture I hoped looked like a peace offering or a ritual. "I'm your humble servant, your worshipper. Please, I beg you, cease the storm." Nimbus's tail flicked once more, and the thunder cracked sharply, as though he found my plea amusing. The rain intensified. I scrambled to grab towels, buckets, anything that might stem the tide. Water dripped from the ceiling fan, plopped onto the floor, and pooled near the couch legs. I'm sure I looked ridiculous, soaked to the bone, slipping and sliding, talking to a cat who seemed to be orchestrating a miniature apocalypse in my living room. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the storm abated. The thunder rolled away, the rain slowed to a mist, and the lights flickered back to their normal steady glow. Nimbus rose elegantly from the windowsill and sauntered over, brushing his sleek black fur against my soaked leg as if to say, "Well done, mortal." I sank onto the couch, soaked and exhausted, staring at the puddles reflecting the now calm ceiling. "You impossible," I muttered, shaking my head. Yet beneath the frustration was a grudging admiration. Nimbus wasn't just any cat. He was a force of nature. As I sat there, shivering and dripping, I realized that the line between pet ownership and worship was becoming increasingly blurred. But maybe that was okay. After all, how many people could say their cat controlled the weather? I glanced at Nimbus, who was already settling back onto his windowsill throne, eyes fixed on the now peaceful sky outside. I couldn't help but wonder what other surprises he had in store. The indoor thunderstorm was just the beginning. "Nimbus, if you were planning anything else, could you at least give me a heads up? Preferably one that doesn't involve indoor deluges." He blinked once. Or maybe it was just a trick of the light. Either way, I knew this was far from over. With a resigned sigh, I grabbed another towel and began the long task of drying out my suddenly aquatic living room. The chaos, the absurdity, and the unblinking green eyes were now a permanent part of my life. And honestly, I wasn't sure I could have it any other way. If you'd told me that worshipping a cat could involve smoke alarms and a near arson attempt, I'd have asked if you'd been sniffing the incense yourself. But here I was, knees creaking on my living room floor, surrounded by an eclectic assortment of candles, incense sticks, and a hastily drawn chalk circle that looked more like the blueprint of an ill-fated board game than anything sacred. Nimbus, my sleek black overlord, sat atop the windowsill, his glowing green eyes unblinking, watching me with what I can only describe as regal disdain. "Okay, Nimbus," I muttered, clutching the crumpled sheet of Latin phrases I'd hastily copied from the dubious internet forums of occult cat worshippers. "If you were going to control the weather, demand reverence, and mutter ancient incantations, then I'm going to at least try to play along, for the sake of peace and my own sanity." I took a deep breath, trying to summon the solemnity of a medieval monk, but instead sounded like a sleep-deprived man attempting to recite a grocery list in Latin. "A feline dominus quae tempestates regis." I stumbled over the words, waving my arms in what I hoped were ritualistic gestures, rather than a desperate attempt to swat at an invisible fly. Nimbus blinked. Or rather, he didn't blink, maintaining that eerie stare that made me question my own life choices. He flicked his tail once, with a measured grace that suggested he was simultaneously unimpressed and amused. The incense I'd lit, a suspiciously cheap lavender scent, began to billow smoke, curling in lazy spirals toward the ceiling. Suddenly, the smoke alarm erupted with a shrill, unforgiving scream that shattered the fragile solemnity of the moment.
"Son of a biscuit!"
I yelped, waving my hands frantically to clear the smoke, setting off a small wind tunnel that sent candles flickering and Nimbus looking mildly interested for the first time. Maggie, who had been sitting on the couch with a look somewhere between concern and amusement, stood up, pushing her glasses up her nose. "Are you trying to summon a storm or just a fire brigade?" she quipped dryly. I shot her a sheepish grin, holding up the incense stick like a peace offering. "I swear it's supposed to be a ritual." To appease Nimbus, I explained, gesturing toward the cat who now sat primly, completely unbothered by the chaos. "He's probably just enjoying the free entertainment," Maggie said, plopping back down with a smirk. "You know, the great and terrible Nimbus, ruler of weather and smoke alarms." As the smoke cleared and the smoke alarm finally quieted, I glanced out the window. The storm that had been brewing, dark clouds thrashing across the sky like an angry sea, had abruptly calmed. The sky was now a soft twilight blue, the air heavy but still. "Did you see that?" I whispered, eyes wide. "Nimbus, did he do that?" Maggie shrugged, but even she looked a little unsettled. Maybe your ritual actually worked, she said, half joking, half serious. Or maybe the storm just got bored. I wasn't so sure. The timing was too perfect, too uncanny. Later, in the softened glow of the living room, I tentatively approached Nimbus, now curled up on a cushion, his tail twitching lazily. I knelt and offered him a small bowl of milk, half spilled in my earlier panic, and a pinch of catnip. He sniffed the offerings with a dignified sniff, then, to my astonishment, blinked once. A slow, deliberate blink, the first in days. I felt a strange warmth spread through me, a fragile truce forged in the flickering candlelight and the scent of lavender incense. Maybe this wasn't just madness. Maybe, just maybe, Nimbus wanted something from me beyond worship, and maybe I wanted the same. As the night deepened, I sat back watching my enigmatic companion with a new sense of wonder. The cat that never blinks had, at least for one evening, blinked at me. And the storm outside had, at least for one evening, been silenced. Was it coincidence, magic? The random chaos of suburban life? I didn't have the answers. But one thing was certain, life with Nimbus was never going to be dull, and with that thought, I prepared myself for whatever absurdity would come next. Because if worshipping a cat involved this much chaos, I was all in. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a very strange, very hilarious journey. The doorbell rang with a sharp, insistent tone that shattered the fragile calm of a Sunday afternoon. I opened the door to find Tom, my neighbor from 2 houses down, standing there with his arms crossed, a scowl firmly planted on his face. His jacket was soaked, water dripping steadily from the sleeves onto the welcome mat, and yet, through the window behind him, the sky was unmistakably clear and sunny. "Hey," Tom said, voice low but tense. "You gotta explain something, it's raining on my porch. Right now, and it stops the moment I step away. What the hell's going on over here?" I blinked, something I usually did far too often when Nimbus was around, though not in his presence, of course. Because he never blinked and tried to summon an answer that didn't sound like I was about to confess to summoning a localized weather anomaly. I guess Nimbus might have something to do with it," I said, gesturing vaguely toward the living room where, true to form, the sleek black cat sat perched on the windowsill, his unblinking green eyes fixed on us all like some ancient, inscrutable oracle. Nimbus seemed utterly unimpressed by the human drama unfolding beneath him. His posture was regal, his fur immaculate, despite the obvious chaos he caused. A faint breeze fluttered the curtains behind him, and I could swear the temperature dropped a degree. Tom's eyes narrowed. "You re-joking, right? Your cat controls the weather now." Before I could answer, Maggie appeared, strolling up the walkway with the casual confidence of someone who had seen one too many bizarre incidents involving Nimbus and found a way to cope with them all. She leaned against the fence, arms crossed, a half-smile playing on her lips. "Well, if Nimbus is the cause," Maggie said dryly, "I think he's overdue for a raise. I mean, controlling weather is a full-time job, and I don't see him clocking in anywhere." Tom shot her a look, but the tension eased just a bit. Maggie had a way of making the absurd seem almost reasonable, or at least bearable. I rubbed the back of my neck, feeling the familiar flush of embarrassment. "Look, I know this sounds crazy, but yes, Nimbus has been unusual. The rain, the breezes, the random temperature drops, they all seem to happen when he's around. And sometimes he mutters Latin phrases." Latin, Tom scoffed. "Are you sure you're not just losing it?" "I'm not," I insisted, "at least not entirely." Nimbus blinked once. Okay, maybe not once. He never blinked, but his gaze shifted sharply to me, as if to say, "Watch your tone, mortal." The neighbors murmured amongst themselves, exchanging skeptical and worried looks. The neighborhood had always been quiet, predictable. Nimbus was turning that upside down, and they weren't sure how to feel about it. Just then, a sudden gust of wind swept down the street, scattering leaves and extinguishing a candle on the porch. Everyone jumped, and nervous laughter rippled through the group. "See," I said, gesturing helplessly. "This is what I mean. It's like living with a tiny, unblinking storm cloud that occasionally speaks dead languages and demands weird rituals. Maggie chuckled. Weird rituals. Don't forget the incense and the chanting. Your lucky Nimbus hasn't demanded a throne yet. That's next, I muttered, rubbing my eyes. I'm pretty sure he expects it. Tom shook his head, half amused, half exasperated. Well, just promise me you'll keep an eye on him before he decides to flood the neighborhood. No promises, I said, smiling despite myself, but I'll try. Nimbus, in turn, shifted his position, tail flicking with the slightest hint of satisfaction. The unblinking green eyes seemed to gleam with some inscrutable amusement, as if he found the whole suburban melodrama endlessly entertaining. As the neighbors slowly dispersed, still whispering about the strange cat and the stranger owner, I felt a mixture of relief and dread. The confrontation hadn't gone as badly as I feared, but it was a reminder that Nimbus's powers, or whatever they were no longer a private matter. I closed the door and leaned against it, exhaling deeply. Maggie clapped me on the shoulder. "You're doing fine," she said. "Just remember, when life gives you a weather-controlling cat, sometimes you have to laugh or you'll cry." I nodded, glancing toward Nimbus. He was perched like a dark sentinel by the window, eyes locked on me. Maybe, just maybe, I was starting to understand the strange rhythm of this new life. And as the wind whispered through the trees outside, carrying a hint of rain, the living room looked more like the aftermath of a particularly eccentric wizard's workshop than the home of a suburban pet owner. Treats were scattered across the floor in an arcane pattern. A clicker dangled from a precarious pile of books, and a notebook labeled Nimbus Training Log lay open, filled with hastily scribbled observations and a growing sense of exasperation. I paced back and forth, armed with a handful of treats in one hand and my best attempt at a commanding voice in the other. "Sit, Nimbus," I said, voice firm but hopeful. Or, to be more accurate, I said seed, Nimbus, because by now I was pretty sure that Latin phrases might be the only language this mysterious feline recognized. Nimbus, perched with regal indifference on the windowsill, did not move. His green eyes, those unblinking, piercing orbs, were locked onto me with an expression that could only be described as amused contempt. I swear if cats had a monarchy, Nimbus would be king, and I was the lowly subject fumbling through my royal duties. Undeterred, I crouched down and extended a treat toward him. Here I coaxed, a reward for obedience. Nimbus blinked. No, wait, he didn't blink. He just stared. Then, with the slowness of a celestial event, he lifted a paw and swiped the treat off the windowsill, sending it tumbling onto the floor. He didn't eat it. Instead, he batted it around like some sort of tiny black orb, as if testing its gravity or perhaps mocking my attempts at training. "Very funny," I muttered, picking up the wayward snack. I tried again. This time, I used the clicker, pressing it with an enthusiastic beep. "Sit," I repeated, this time with a mix of desperation and theatrical flair. Nimbus turned his back on me, tail flicking with unmistakable disdain, and sauntered away like a shadow slipping through the room. I sighed and rubbed my temples. Maybe it was time to reconsider my strategy. But stubbornness is a curious thing, especially when it's directed at a cat who might just be a weather-controlling, Latin-speaking enigma. Over the next hour, the battle of wills continued. I set up obstacle courses with pillows, tried to teach Nimbus to come when called, and even attempted to decipher the meaning behind his cryptic Latin mutterings. Each effort was met with either complete indifference or a sly disruption. At one point, Nimbus managed to unroll an entire roll of toilet paper in the hallway, creating a snowy trail that made our cat and human power struggle look more like a winter festival gone awry. Exhausted but not defeated, I flopped down on the couch, clutching my now tattered training log. Nimbus jumped up beside me and, to my surprise, nestled against my side, purring softly. It was a rare moment of warmth from my enigmatic companion, a silent truce in our ongoing war of wills. As I stroked his sleek black fur, I realized that perhaps this was what companionship truly looked like, a messy, unpredictable dance of control and surrender, chaos and calm. And maybe, just maybe, I was learning to appreciate the humor in being thoroughly outmatched by a cat that never blinks. But as I drifted off to sleep with Nimbus curled beside me, I couldn't help but wonder what tricks he had up his sleeve next. Because in this house, the rules were always subject to change, and the cat was still very much in charge. And so, the saga of pet owner antics rolled on, a comedy of errors and affections that I was only beginning to understand. Would I ever train Nimbus? Or was I just another player in his grand, unblinking game? The answer, it seemed, was as elusive as the cat himself. And with that thought lingering in the air, I knew tomorrow would bring another round in this wonderfully absurd battle. The cat might never blink, but I sure wasn't going to stop trying. The sky outside had been an unremarkable suburban gray for most of the day. The kind of dull cloud cover that makes you forget it's actually there until it starts raining. But by late afternoon, that complacent gray began to darken, folding into heavy, swirling charcoal that made the street lamps flicker on early, as though the world was preparing for something ominous. I was staring out the window, a half-empty cup of coffee cooling in my hand, when the first unnerving signs appeared. Nimbus, my sleek black cat, with those unnervingly unblinking green eyes, sat perched on the windowsill as if he were the conductor of this gathering storm. His tail flicked lazily, but his gaze was unyielding, fixed on the growing tempest outside. The wind began to pick up, but it wasn't the usual suburban breeze. It felt deliberate, almost choreographed, swirling leaves and loose papers into a small whirlwind that danced at the edge of the yard. A low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance, gradually swelling into a growl that vibrated through the house's bones. I swallowed hard, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. "Nimbus," I said, voice wavering, "are you doing this?" Of course, he didn't blink, didn't even twitch his whiskers. It was as if the question was beneath him, or perhaps he was waiting for me to figure it out on my own. My gaze shifted to the weather app on my phone, which stubbornly insisted there was no storm forecasted. "Great," I muttered. "Just great." The kind of great that makes you question your grip on reality. Just then, the doorbell rang. It was Mr. Jenkins, the neighborhood's resident eccentric and retired meteorologist, clutching his ever-present notebook with a wild gleam in his eye. "I thought you might want to see this," he said, waving his notebook like a talisman. Inside, the pages were filled with hastily scrawled charts, indecipherable symbols, and notes tying Nimbus to inexplicable weather anomalies. "Look at this," Jenkins said excitedly. "Localized atmospheric pressure shifts, electromagnetic disturbances, all centered on your property. This isn't coincidence." "Your cat is the eye of the storm," I blinked. Well, I tried to blink back at Nimbus, but he was already giving me that immortal, unblinking stare, as if to say, "Yes, I am." Now what? The wind outside howled louder, rattling the windows, and a sudden cold gust swept through the room despite all the windows being firmly shut. I shivered, tension crackling in the air like static. "Okay," I said, more to myself than anyone else, "if you behind this, Nimbus, then we need to talk." Nimbus responded by stretching luxuriously, letting out a slow, deliberate yawn that revealed a flash of sharp teeth. It was the kind of gesture that said, "Talk all you want, but I decide when the storm ends." I paced the room, searching for any clue, any leverage. Then it struck me the Latin phrases I'd overheard Nimbus muttering during the last week. Maybe this was the key. I crouched down, meeting his gaze, and began to recite what little Latin I'd managed to piece together from my frantic research. Pax Nimbus, temporare tempestatum. The cat's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, and the air seemed to thicken. Outside, the wind momentarily stilled, the thunder paused, and a hesitant silence filled the room. Encouraged, I pressed on, awkwardly weaving together a patchwork of Latin phrases that I hoped meant peace and calm. Nimbus blinked, just once. And then the storm outside resumed fiercer than before. I staggered back, heart pounding. "I get it," I gasped. "You re not just a cat. You re a weather god in fur. But why me?" Mr. Jenkins adjusted his spectacles, peering at Nimbus with a mixture of awe and suspicion. "Perhaps you re the chosen mortal, destined to serve as his humble worshipper," he mused. "Chosen?" I echoed, doubtful but strangely relieved to have a narrative, even a ridiculous one. "Well, Mr. Jenkins, I'm not sure I'm cut out for divine worship. I can barely keep a houseplant alive." Nimbus, apparently unimpressed by my self-deprecation, jumped down from the sill and sauntered toward the center of the room. The lights flickered, and a sharp crack of thunder shook the house, sending a shiver down my spine. I watched, part terrified, part fascinated, as the storm seemed to pulse in rhythm with Nimbus's movements. "Okay," I said, steeling myself, "let's make a deal. You stop the storm, and I'll do whatever strange rituals you want. No more indoor thunderstorms, no more temperature swings, and maybe, just maybe, you blink once in a while." Nimbus stopped, turning to look at me with those eternal green eyes. For a moment, I thought I saw something almost like amusement flicker there. Then, with a slow, deliberate blink, nothing. The storm outside began to abate, the thunder rolling away into distant grumbles. Meh. Jenkins let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "We may have just witnessed a breakthrough," he whispered. I slumped into the nearest chair, exhausted but oddly exhilarated. My life had become a surreal comedy of weather control and feline worship, and somehow I was beginning to accept it. "Nimbus," I said softly, "you may be the most frustrating roommate I've ever had, but maybe, just maybe, we can weather this storm together." The cat, ever inscrutable, settled into my lap, still unblinking, still commanding. Outside, the clouds broke apart, letting in a hesitant sliver of sunlight. The storm was brewing no more, at least for now. And just like that, the suburban quiet was restored, but I knew better. Nimbus was still watching, still waiting, and the next chapter of our bizarre companionship was just beginning. Negotiating peace with a cat who might control the weather was never something I imagined on a Tuesday afternoon. But here we were, drenched and delirious, in the midst of an indoor thunderstorm that Nimbus, my unblinking feline overlord, had orchestrated with precision and, apparently, a wicked sense of humor. It started with the Latin phrasebook. I had scoured the internet, piecing together what little I could find about the ancient phrases Nimbus muttered under his breath during his silent, statuesque sittings. The words were cryptic, a blend of liturgical incantations and obscure weather-related terms, which only fueled my growing conviction that Nimbus was no ordinary cat. Armed with this dubious knowledge, I set out to negotiate. If Nimbus demanded worship, then worship he would receive, albeit in the most ridiculous, desperate fashion. I cleared the living room, pushing furniture against the walls to create the semblance of a sacred space. In the center, I arranged Nimbus's favorite cat treats around a flickering candle, an altar of sorts for the weather god I had unwittingly adopted. Clutching the phrase book in one hand and a trembling voice in the other, I began the incantation. My Latin was rusty at best, a patchwork of mispronunciations and hopeful guesses, but I soldiered on, my voice echoing oddly against the suburban walls. Nimbus sat on the windowsill, his green eyes piercing and unblinking, watching me with an inscrutable expression that I swear combined disdain, amusement, and maybe a hint of curiosity. As I muttered the phrases, a sudden, inexplicable chill swept through the room. The lights flickered, shadows danced, and then without warning the heavens opened indoors. Water rained from the ceiling in a deluge, thunder rumbled ominously, and lightning crackled with an eerie precision just beyond the windows. I froze, soaked to the bone and heart pounding, caught between panic and the surreal comedy of the situation. Nimbus, utterly unbothered, flicked his tail with the poise of a feline monarch. I tried to keep going, voice wavering, as the storm raged around us. "Pax! Pax!" I pleaded, desperately hoping the Latin for peace would calm this absurd tempest. To my astonishment, the storm began to abate. The rain slowed, thunder softened, and Nimbus's tail stopped flicking. Then, quite unexpectedly, those piercing green eyes blinked just once. It was a tiny gesture, but it felt monumental, a subtle truce between man and cat, chaos and calm. Exhausted, I collapsed onto the couch, dripping and breathless. Nimbus leapt down and settled beside me, his regal posture softened by a rare moment of affection. The room was silent except for the faint drip of water and the steady rhythm of my slowing heartbeat. Negotiations were never easy, especially when your adversary is a mysterious, possibly supernatural cat who commands the weather and demands worship in ancient Latin. But in that wet, chaotic moment, I realized that beneath the madness was a strange kind of companionship. Nimbus and I were unlikely partners in a cosmic comedy, navigating absurdity with a mix of desperation, humor, and the occasional, inexplicable miracle. And as I looked into those unblinking eyes, now blinking ever so slightly, I knew this was only the beginning of our journey. One way or another, we would find a way to coexist, or at least survive the next storm. "Salve, Nimbus," I've whispered, my voice thick with awe and exhaustion. "Let's try peace." Nimbus tilted his head a slow, deliberate blink. Then, as if granting a royal decree, he settled in, the unspoken treaty sealed. For now. But I had a feeling the weather and our lives would never be quite the same again. The evening settled around the house like a thick velvet curtain, muffling the usual suburban hum. I sat cross-legged on the living room floor, a scatter of papers and weather charts strewn haphazardly around me. Across from me, Mr. Jenkins shuffled through a battered notebook, his eyebrows furrowed in that familiar way he did when he was on the verge of a grand theory or a grand delusion. Above us both, Nimbus perched on the windowsill, his sleek black for a striking silhouette against the dim light. Those unblinking green eyes reflecting the flicker of the street lamp outside. "Look," Mr. Jenkins said, tapping the notebook with a finger stained from years of scribbling, "I think we've been looking at Nimbus all wrong. He's not just some bored cat with a flair for weather manipulation. He waved a yellowed parchment. This might explain his powers. It's a fragment of an ancient text about a guardian spirit bound to watch over a territory, controlling elements to protect rather than punish." I blinked. Well, not literally. Nimbus was the one who didn't blink. A guardian spirit, like some mystical cat superhero. "That sounds a bit far-fetched, even for you, Jenkins," he grinned, the kind of grin that meant he'd already convinced himself. "Maybe, but look here." He pointed to a passage written in flowing Latin script. "This speaks of an entity that commands storms, calms tempests, and yet demands respect through ritual. Sounds a lot like our black enigma." Nimbus gave a soft, almost imperceptible purr, then lipped down gracefully, padding silently to my side. His emerald eyes locked with mine, unblinking as always. But this time there was something different, a subtle warmth. A flicker of something almost tender beneath the commanding gaze. I reached out hesitantly, hand trembling as it hovered over his fur. To my surprise, Nimbus nudged against it, the sleek fur brushing against my fingers. The sensation was electric, a strange mix of comfort and awe. "See," Mr. Jenkins whispered, leaning closer. "He's not just chaos, he's protection. He's been guarding this neighborhood all along." I swallowed hard, the absurdity of it all clashing with a sudden swell of affection. Here was a cat who could summon storms and speak Latin phrases that sounded like spells, yet who also wanted somehow to be understood and accepted. Feeling a surge of boldness, I grabbed the ancient text and began reading aloud, stumbling through the Latin phrases as best I could. The words rolled off my tongue, strange and melodic in the quiet room. As I spoke, a soft wind stirred, fluttering the papers around us, carrying the faint scent of rain and earth. Nimbus sat back, eyes fixed on me, his posture regal yet relaxed. For the first time, the lines between the supernatural and the mundane blurred into something beautiful and absurd, a shared secret between man and cat. "Looks like we've got ourselves a real live guardian spirit," I said with a nervous laugh, glancing at Mr. Jenkins. "Indeed," he replied, notebook clutched tightly. "And you were the chosen human, apparently." Nimbus, the cat who never blinked, gave a slow, deliberate blink, a small, almost imperceptible gesture that felt like a benediction. I smiled, the chaos of the past weeks settling into a new kind of harmony. Maybe living with a cat who controlled the weather and spoke ancient languages wasn't so insane after all. Maybe it was exactly the kind of weird, wonderful companionship I never knew I needed. As the soft breeze drifted through the open window, scattering the remaining papers and carrying the fresh promise of rain, I felt the strange, unspoken bond between us deepen, a bond forged in absurdity, curiosity, and an unexpected tenderness. So I said, looking down at Nimbus, "What now, guardian of the suburbs? What's our next move?" Nimbus's green eyes gleamed with mischief and something unnameable, and for once, I wasn't afraid to find out. The story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The storm had finally begun to wane, the once furious winds softening into a gentle breeze that whispered through the battered trees and scattered debris. I found myself standing on the porch, rain slicking down my jacket, water pooling around my shoes, and a strange mixture of relief and exhaustion washing over me. The sky, once an angry swath of charcoal and gunmetal, was now streaked with pale bands of sunlight, the clouds reluctantly giving way to a hesitant blue. Nimbus, as if sensing the shift in mood, had taken his familiar spot on the windowsill inside, his sleek black fur gleaming even in the dim light, those unblinking green eyes fixed silently on the clearing sky. For hours I'd battled the surreal tempest conjured seemingly by my own cat Nimbus, the creature who had turned my suburban life upside down with his mysterious powers and inscrutable demands. The thunderstorm inside my house, the Latin incantations muttered in the dead of night, the bizarre rituals I'd attempted all culminated in this moment of calm that felt almost too fragile to trust. The neighborhood was a study in post-storm bewilderment. Tom, my usually easygoing neighbor, was out front, shoveling mud off his driveway with a grimace that echoed my own exhaustion. I approached cautiously, unsure if I should say something or just commiserate in silence. He looked up, eyes wide but tired, and gave me a half smile. "Well," he said, "that was something else. I've never seen weather like that around here. Pretty sure my lawn sprinkler hasn't been on in days." I chuckled, the sound coming out a little shaky. "Yeah, Nimbus has a way of letting me know who's in charge." Tom raised an eyebrow but wisely said no more, just nodded and went back to work. Inside, Maggie arrived armed with 2 steaming cups of coffee and a smirk that was almost comforting. She gave me a once-over, eyes twinkling with that dry sarcasm I'd come to love. "So how's the weather god today?" she asked, handing me a cup. Humbled, I replied, taking a grateful sip, and more than a little soaked. She laughed softly, then lowered her voice. "You know, maybe this whole thing is just a weird phase. Or maybe Nimbus just likes messing with you. Either way, you rehandling it better than I expected." Her words grounded me, reminding me that no matter how absurd things got, I wasn't in this alone. Jenkins, true to form, was nearby, flipping through his ever-present notebook, like a mad scientist obsessed with decoding the storm's secrets. He muttered excitedly about pressure systems and atmospheric anomalies, his eyes bright with the thrill of discovery even amid the chaos. Nimbus, for his part, remained regal and inscrutable. His gaze never wavered from the window, the faint glow of his green eyes somehow both unsettling and oddly reassuring. It was as if he was silently acknowledging the truce the storm had passed, but his presence was a constant, a reminder that chaos was never far away. As I looked around at the scattered leaves, broken branches, and soaked ground, I realized this was a turning point. The neighborhood, though battered, was beginning to recover, neighbors exchanging stories and helping each other patch up the damage. And I, too, was shifting from bewildered pet owner to someone who had learned to embrace the unpredictable, the weird, and the wonderful. "Looks like we're in this together," I said quietly, more to Nimbus than anyone else. The cat's eyes flicked to me for a brief moment, unblinking and intense, before he settled back into his throne on the windowsill, a silent king surveying his domain. And for the first time since Nimbus arrived, I felt a flicker of peace. The storm had passed, but our story was far from over. Life with Nimbus would remain a wild, chaotic dance, sometimes frustrating, often hilarious, and always utterly unpredictable. But maybe that was exactly what I needed. As the sun finally broke through the last of the clouds, casting warm light across the drenched street, I stepped back inside, ready to face whatever came next. Because if there was one thing I'd learned, it was that with Nimbus around, normal was a fleeting illusion, and that was perfectly okay. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew the cat that never blinks was watching, waiting, and perhaps, just perhaps, planning the next storm. I used to think that normalcy was this elusive, fragile thing, something I had to guard and protect at all costs. But after weeks of living with Nimbus, I realized that normal was a shape-shifting concept, especially when your cat might be a weather-controlling, Latin-muttering enigma demanding ritualistic worship. Tonight, sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, surrounded by the half-forgotten tools of my latest ritual, a candle, a worn Latin phrasebook, and an array of oddly arranged cat toys, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Nimbus, as regal as ever, was perched on the armrest of the couch, his sleek black fur shining under the soft glow of the lamp. His green eyes, unblinking as usual, were fixed on me with an intensity that could have sparked a minor thunderstorm, if he wished. It was no longer fear or frustration that filled me, but a kind of amused acceptance. The ritual didn't feel like a desperate plea anymore. It was more like a game we both played, a dance between human logic and feline enigma. I flipped through the phrasebook again, murmuring a Latin incantation under my breath. Not because I believed it would change anything, but because it felt right. The rain outside tapped gently against the window, a steady rhythm that matched the calm beating of my heart. Suddenly, the doorbell rang, breaking the quiet. Maggie stood there, thermos in hand, her sharp eyes taking in the scene, with a mix of disbelief and amusement. "So," she said dryly, stepping inside and setting the thermos on the table, "this is your new religion." I shrugged, a grin tugging at the corner of my mouth. "Something like that." She plopped down on the couch next to Nimbus, who barely acknowledged her presence, maintaining his imperious gaze. "You know," Maggie continued, "you're the only person I know who's trying to negotiate with a cat in dead languages." "Desperate times," I replied, "call for desperate rituals." Her laughter filled the room, a welcome break from the surreal tension that had been my constant companion. Maggie's presence grounded me, reminding me that amidst the chaos I wasn't alone. We talked about everything and nothing, the absurdity of Nimbus's powers, the weirdness of my rituals, and the strange peace I was beginning to find in all this madness. As if on cue, Nimbus flicked his tail, and the lights dimmed momentarily. Outside, a distant rumble of thunder rolled through the neighborhood, but inside, the air remained warm and dry. I watched, fascinated, as the mild storm raged just beyond the walls of my home, and for the first time, I felt a sense of awe rather than panic. Nimbus was in control, yes, but I was no longer fighting against it. I was learning to live in the eye of his storm. Later that night, I found myself talking quietly to Nimbus, the moonlight casting long shadows across the room. "I don't know what you are," I whispered, "but I think I'm okay with it, maybe even grateful." For a long moment, Nimbus said nothing. Then, very slowly, he blinked. Just once, a deliberate, measured blink that felt like a gesture of trust, or perhaps the beginning of one. In that small, unblinking world of his, I found a truce, not peace, exactly, not normalcy, but something better, a strange companionship shaped by chaos, humor, and the unspoken understanding that sometimes the best way to deal with the impossible is to accept it and laugh. As the night deepened, I settled down beside him, ready to face whatever strange, unpredictable day Nimbus would conjure next. Because now, I wasn't just a bewildered pet owner, I was a willing participant in the absurd dance of life with the cat that never blinked. And somehow that was enough. Life, it seems, has a way of settling into rhythms even when your house occasionally experiences sudden indoor rain showers and inexplicable breezes summoned by a cat who refuses to blink. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to accept a feline deity's quirks as part of my daily routine, but here I am, coffee in hand, watching Nimbus observe the world with those unblinking green eyes that pierce right through any lingering shred of denial. Morning light filters lazily through the curtains as the soft patter of water droplets taps against the windowsill. I blink once, then twice, realizing the sound is coming from inside the house. Nimbus is doing, of course. The indoor drizzle is his subtle way of announcing his presence, a reminder that the weather is never quite under my control anymore. The faint scent of wet earth mingles with the aroma of brewing coffee, creating a strangely comforting atmosphere. Nimbus sits perched on the windowsill, sleek black fur shimmering faintly in the morning light, eyes fixed and unblinking as always. I swear he's judging me for the rumpled state of my pajama shirt. "Good morning, Your Majesty," I mutter, more out of habit than belief. Nimbus twitches his tail once in acknowledgement, a silent decree that the day's weather, both literal and metaphorical, will be dictated by his whims. The chaos that once had me frazzled and searching for explanations has softened into a daily comedy show where I'm both the star and the audience. I've learned to navigate the unpredictable weather tantrums with a resigned grin and a dry joke at the ready. When Nimbus conjures a sudden breeze that scatters my paperwork or summons a mini thunderstorm in the kitchen, I respond with a mixture of exasperation and reluctant admiration. It's a strange life, certainly, but it's mine now. Maggie dropped by one afternoon, her sharp eyes sizing up the scene with the practiced skepticism of someone who's known me long enough to expect the unexpected. She perched on the edge of the couch, mug of coffee in hand, ready to deliver her usual brand of sarcastic support. "So, how's the weather-obsessed pet overlord today?" she asked, her tone dry but warm. Nimbus, sprawled majestically across the couch, blinked not once. His tail flicked slowly, as if acknowledging the title but refusing to dignify it with more than a regal disdain. "I think he's planning a hurricane for dinner," I replied, a smirk tugging at the corner of my mouth. Maggie laughed, shaking her head. "You always did like a bit of excitement. Just don't let him turn your life into a disaster zone." "Too late for that," I said, glancing at the window where dark clouds gathered ominously, only to dissipate moments later as Nimbus's mood shifted. Our conversations have become a mix of the mundane and the absurd, a balance I cherish. Maggie's pragmatic grounding keeps me sane, while Nimbus's mysterious presence keeps life anything but boring. Then there are the mornings like today, when Nimbus demands his breakfast with all the theatrical flair of a monarch issuing a royal command. I was halfway through making toast when a sudden small whirlwind whipped through the kitchen, sending napkins and a stray sock dancing into the air. "Really?" I said, exasperated but amused as Nimbus sat calmly amidst the chaos, tail flicking with an air of entitlement. His eyes locked on me unblinking, as if to say, "You may be the human, but I am the storm." I sighed and prepared his meal with exaggerated care, murmuring a mock incantation just to keep the peace. The absurdity of it all never fails to make me laugh, even as I wonder how I ended up here sharing my life with a cat who might just be a weather-controlling ancient being. Evenings have taken on a peaceful rhythm despite the day's unpredictability. On the porch, under skies streaked with orange and pink, Nimbus and I share silent moments that speak louder than words. His tail flicks slowly, the unblinking gaze softened by the fading light, and for a brief time, the world feels calm. I watch the neighborhood settle into quiet, the distant hum of life a comforting backdrop. Nimbus, ever the enigmatic companion, seems content to rule his domain with quiet dignity. In these moments, I realize that normalcy isn't about control or predictability. It's about embracing the chaos with a smile, finding joy in the absurd, and accepting that sometimes the best kind of companionship comes with unblinking green eyes and a little weather on the side. And so life with Nimbus continues, unpredictable, hilarious, and strangely perfect in its own unhinged way. Tomorrow may bring another indoor thunderstorm or a sudden gust that scatters my carefully arranged papers, but I'll be ready. Because in this house, ruled by a cat who never blinks, the only constant is delightful chaos. As I settle in for the night, Nimbus curls beside me, purring softly, a rare moment of affection that feels like a reward for surviving another day under his whimsical reign. I reach out to stroke his sleek fur, and for once, he doesn't move away. Maybe, just maybe, we've found our rhythm, and tomorrow. Well, tomorrow is another story entirely. The night had settled in with its usual calm, or at least, as calm as one could expect when living under the watchful, unblinking gaze of a cat who might very well control the weather. I found myself perched on the edge of the couch, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee that had long since lost any claim to warmth. Across from me, Maggie was sprawled comfortably on the living room floor, her arms folded and her eyes narrowed with a look that was equal parts skepticism and amusement. Nimbus, our midnight monarch, prowled about with all the regal bearing of a small, fur-covered deity, his unblinking green eyes surveying his domain as if it belonged solely to him, which, by now, it probably did. "You know," Maggie began, her voice dripping with dry wit, "if Nimbus starts demanding sacrifices, I'm out." I chuckled, despite the knot of anxiety still twisting in my stomach. At this point, I wouldn't even be surprised. Nimbus paused mid-step, fixing Maggie with a stare so intense it felt like he was measuring her for some unknown purpose, perhaps to decide if she was worthy of his enigmatic whims. She met his gaze without flinching, which only made me more certain that she was the only sane person left in this house. "Honestly," she continued, "I don't know how you keep your sanity with that little storm cloud on your shoulder." "It's a daily challenge," I admitted, swirling the dregs of my coffee. "Especially when he starts muttering Latin phrases at 3 in the morning, and then the power flickers like he's conducting a symphony of chaos." Maggie snorted. "Sounds like a party. You should invite me next time." Her sarcasm was a balm, slicing through the surreal haze that Nimbus's presence had cast over my life. Amidst the bizarre weather events, the whispered incantations, and the inexplicable demands for worship, Maggie's pragmatism was a steady lighthouse. She grounded me when the edges of reality began to blur. "So, what's the plan?" I asked, grateful for her level-headedness. "Just keep pretending it's a regular cat and hope the thunderstorms don't get any worse." "That, or get a priest," she said with mock seriousness. But I don't think Nimbus would appreciate that. We laughed, the sound echoing warmly in the room. It was a rare moment of normalcy, and I clung to it like a life raft. Later, as the clock ticked past midnight, we found ourselves in the kitchen, perched on stools by the counter. The soft hum of the refrigerator filled the space between our quiet conversation. Outside, a gentle wind teased the curtains, making them sway like spectral dancers. Nimbus sat on the windowsill, his silhouette outlined by the moonlight, eyes still fixed unwaveringly on the shifting shadows beyond. "You ever think," Maggie mused, "that maybe Nimbus knows exactly what he's doing? Like he's fully aware of the chaos he's causing and is just toying with you for fun?" I nodded slowly. "It certainly feels that way sometimes. Like I'm just a character in some cosmic joke he's orchestrating." "Well," she said, smirking, "if that's the case, you read the punchline." Her humor was a lifeline, a way to make sense of the madness. With Maggie around, the line between reality and absurdity blurred less dangerously. She didn't dismiss the weirdness outright, but she didn't let it consume us either. One afternoon, after Nimbus had once again summoned a sudden gust that sent papers flying across the room, Maggie sat back in her chair, shaking her head with a wry smile. I was frantically gathering the scattered sheets, muttering apologies to the cat, who watched me with inscrutable eyes. You know, Maggie said if you ever want to start a research project on supernatural cats, I'm your woman. Ivy got notebooks and everything. I laughed, imagining her donning a lab coat and wielding a clipboard, taking meticulous notes on Nimbus's every move. Maybe we should, I said. At least then I'd have a record of all this madness. Just don't let Nimbus catch you, she teased. He might not like being studied. Through it all, Maggie's presence was a steadying force. She was the friend who didn't panic when the sky darkened indoors or when Nimbus hissed some indecipherable phrase that sounded suspiciously like a curse. She was the voice of reason and the source of laughter, the one who reminded me that even in chaos, friendship could be a beacon. As the chapter of our bizarre lives with Nimbus unfolded, I realized that while the cat might rule the household with an unblinking stare and mysterious powers, it was Maggie's grounded support that kept me from losing myself entirely. Together, we navigated the absurdity, finding humor and resilience in the eye of the storm. And just when I thought I might finally catch a break, Nimbus leaped onto the windowsill again, eyes gleaming, as the wind picked up outside, a reminder that with him around, the chaos was far from over. Well, Maggie said, standing up and stretching, I'm always here if you need a reality check or a sarcastic remark. I'll take both, I replied, smiling despite the looming uncertainty. Because with Nimbus in the house, normal was a distant memory, but at least I wasn't facing the madness alone. It was a Tuesday, which in our household had come to mean brace yourself for the unexpected, but nothing quite prepared me for the whirlwind that was Misera, Jenkins' final theory. I had just settled into my usual post-chaos chair, rumpled, coffee-stained, and utterly resigned when the doorbell rang with the urgency of a town crier announcing the apocalypse. Opening the door, I found Jenkins, notebook clutched like a lifeline, eyes wild and breathless, as if he'd sprinted from the depths of an ancient storm. "Gather round," he declared, sweeping past me into the living room. Nimbus, as usual, observed from his regal throne atop the windowsill. Unblinking emerald eyes fixed on Jenkins with what I could only interpret as a mixture of disdain and bemusement. Maggie, ever the pragmatist, appeared behind Jenkins with a raised eyebrow and a half-smirk. "This can't be good," she muttered, folding her arms and leaning against the doorframe. Jenkins wasted no time. Plopping down on the couch with the grace of a man who had long ago abandoned dignity, he flipped open his battered notebook to a page bursting with scrawled diagrams, arcane symbols, and what looked suspiciously like weather maps overlaid with strange runes. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "I present to you the culmination of my research. Nimbus is no ordinary feline. He is the modern incarnation of an ancient weather cult's deity, a living conduit of atmospheric power." Maggie snorted. "So, basically, he's a furry weather god with a bad attitude." Jenkins ignored the quip, launching into an elaborate explanation that involved Latin incantations, celestial alignments, and the peculiar frequency of Nimbus's unblinking stare. The room filled with the sound of his fervent, sometimes breathless, monologue, punctuated by Maggie's dry commentary and my own attempts to decipher the lunacy that somehow felt just plausible enough to entertain. He pointed to a diagram of concentric circles intersected by jagged lightning bolts and scribbled the phrase Tempestus Dometer beneath it. "Latin," he explained, "for master of the storm." "See," Jenkins said, eyes gleaming, "Nimbus controls the weather not just as a party trick, but as a sacred duty passed down through an unbroken line of feline avatars." Nimbus, as if to confirm the claim, flicked his tail with a slow, deliberate motion, his gaze never leaving Jenkins. The PCDR assistance came when Jenkins insisted on performing a ritual to honor Nimbus and perhaps curry favor with the storm god. We migrated to the backyard, where Jenkins produced an assortment of odd items, a feather duster, a hastily printed Latin chant, and a small bowl of water that he insisted represented the primordial ocean. As Jenkins began chanting in a shaky voice, weaving the feather duster through the air with dramatic flair, Nimbus sat nearby. tail twitching in what I could only assume was feline judgment. Maggie and I exchanged glances, silently agreeing that this was peak suburban absurdity. Then came the moment of truth or chaos, depending on your perspective. A small spark from Jenkins's overzealous waving caught on a patch of dry grass, igniting a flicker of flame that quickly grew. Panic ensued, with Jenkins flapping wildly, Maggie grabbing the garden hose, and me attempting to douse the blaze while simultaneously trying not to laugh at the surreal scene. Nimbus, unperturbed, merely blinked once an event so rare it might as well have been a solar eclipse, and hopped onto the fence, disappearing into the twilight with the grace of a cat who had better things to do than babysit amateur weather cultists. As the smoke cleared and the grass was saved, Jenkins turned to me, a sheepish grin replacing his usual intensity. "Well, it's not perfect, but the theory stands." Maggie rolled her eyes. "And here I was worried you'd lost your mind." I looked at Nimbus's empty perch and then back at Jenkins, feeling a strange mix of amusement, bewilderment, and something like acceptance. Maybe the cat really was some kind of weather deity. Or maybe we were all just desperately trying to make sense of the absurd chaos he brought into our lives. Either way, one thing was clear: life with Nimbus was never going to be boring. As Jenkins packed up his notebook, humming a tune that suspiciously resembled a medieval chant, I felt a wave of gratitude for this bizarre little family we'd become. There was magic here, in the chaos, in the friendship, and yes, even in the unblinking stare of a cat who might just control the weather. And tomorrow I'd probably wake up to a thunderstorm inside the house, or Nimbus muttering something in Latin at 3 in the morning. But for now, I was content to sit back, sip my coffee, and watch the clouds gather, because with Nimbus around, the forecast was always unpredictable. The adventure wasn't over. In fact, it was just getting started. And somewhere in the distance, I swear I heard Nimbus purr approvingly. It was one of those rare moments when the world seemed to pause just long enough for me to catch my breath. Nimbus, as always, sat with a statuesque elegance on my lap, his sleek black fur cool against my skin, and those unblinking emerald eyes fixed somewhere beyond the window. Outside, the rain drummed a gentle rhythm on the glass, a quiet counterpoint to the storm of chaos that had become my life since his arrival. I found myself marveling at how far we had come. When Nimbus first strutted through my door, all regal and mysterious, I had been a mixture of excitement and dread. Was he really some supernatural force in feline form, or just a very peculiar cat with a penchant for Latin mutterings and weather manipulation? Over time, whether by accident or design, the two of us had woven ourselves into a strange, unspoken dance, chaotic, bewildering, but undeniably ours. Sitting there, I let my fingers trace the delicate arch of his back, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. It was a grounding sensation in a world that often felt like it was spinning just a little too fast. I thought about all the bizarre rituals I had concocted to placate him, the half-baked Latin chants, the offering of catnip incense, the awkward attempts at worship that usually ended with me tripping over furniture or accidentally summoning a minor thunderstorm in the kitchen. And yet, here he was calm, poised at the center of my daily chaos. The doorbell rang, shattering the peaceful moment. Maggie was here, of course, my pragmatic, sarcastic lifeline in this madness. I opened the door to find her shaking her head with that familiar dry smile. Still worshipping the weather god cat, she teased, stepping inside with the casual confidence of someone who had long ago accepted that normal conversations were a luxury I no longer enjoyed. "He demands it," I replied, half serious, half joking, "and I'm pretty sure he controls the barometer." Maggie laughed, a sound that felt like sunshine breaking through the clouds. We settled in the living room, steaming mugs in hand, while Nimbus watched us from his perch on the window sill. Our conversation danced between absurdity and sincerity, as it always did. Maggie's sarcastic commentary was a balm to my frazzled nerves, reminding me that I wasn't completely alone in this. You know, she said, if Nimbus ever decides to take over the world, you are going to be the first to know, and probably the first to be sacrificed. I rolled my eyes, but the truth in her words was undeniable. Nimbus was no ordinary cat. His unblinking gaze seemed to hold secrets older than the house itself, and sometimes, just sometimes, I caught a flicker of something almost human. Or perhaps something uncomfortably otherworldly. Later that night, armed with a dubious sense of bravery and a half-remembered Latin phrase, I attempted one last ritual. Feather in hand, I waved it awkwardly in a slow circle and whispered the incantation under my breath, hoping to coax some sort of sign from my enigmatic companion. To my surprise, Nimbus responded. He blinked. Just once, slow and deliberate, like a secret acknowledgement between us. And in that simple gesture, years of confusion, frustration, and chaos melted away into a quiet laughter that bubbled up from deep inside me. That slow blink was more than a fleeting expression, it was a bridge. Our unblinking cat had, for one brief moment, blinked at me. And I realized then that perhaps understanding wasn't the point. Maybe it was the bond itself, strange, illogical, and utterly absurd, that mattered most. Days passed in a gentle montage of the ordinary and extraordinary. Nimbus chased stray sunbeams that filtered through the curtains, his graceful leaps casting playful shadows on the walls. I spilled my morning coffee when a sudden breeze whispered through the open window, sending papers fluttering like startled birds. We shared quiet afternoons, sometimes napping side by side as the world outside continued its unpredictable dance. In these moments, the madness of the past weeks settled into a comfortable rhythm. The chaos was no longer a source of anxiety, but a wellspring of joy and companionship. Nimbus was not just a pet or a puzzle to be solved, he was a partner in this surreal comedy, a guardian of the unexplainable, and a companion I had come to cherish beyond reason. As I sat there, watching his unblinking gaze sweep the room, I felt a warmth that had little to do with the weather and everything to do with acceptance. Life with Nimbus was unpredictable, absurd, and utterly hilarious, and somehow that was exactly what I needed. The cat that never blinks had finally opened a window into my own heart, a place where chaos and order, logic and nonsense could coexist in perfect harmony. And for the first time in a long time, I was okay with not knowing all the answers. Because maybe, just maybe, some bonds are meant to be unblinking. I never thought I'd find peace in chaos, but here I am, sprawled on the living room floor, watching Nimbus, my sleek, unblinking enigma, circle me like some sort of furry, weather-controlling deity. The lamp casts a soft glow, flickering occasionally as if responding to some secret rhythm only Nimbus can hear. Outside, the rain taps a gentle tattoo against the window pane, a soothing soundtrack to this quiet moment. For the first time since Nimbus arrived, I'm not scrambling to predict the next bizarre weather event or decode his cryptic Latin murmurs. Instead, I'm laughing quietly, reveling in the absurdity that has become my everyday life. It's strange how quickly the strange becomes normal. Just yesterday, Maggie dropped by leaning casually against the kitchen doorway, her arms folded and a smirk playing on her lips as she watched Nimbus bat a feather toy across the linoleum floor. "So," she said dryly, "Nimbus decided to turn your Zoom meeting into a hurricane, huh?" I nodded, recalling the sudden gust that scattered my carefully arranged notes like confetti. Nimbus's tail flicked mischievously under the fluorescent kitchen light, clearly pleased with himself. Maggie's sarcastic commentary has become a comforting constant, a reminder that this madness is shared and not mine alone to bear. Our conversations have shifted, too. Where once I was desperate to understand every odd phrase Nimbus muttered, now I take his Latin whispers as part of the soundtrack of our life together. Like the indoor breeze swirling down the hallway, carrying the scent of rain and earth, mingling with the warm aroma of brewing coffee. I pause mid-step, locking eyes with Nimbus's unblinking stare, and instead of frustration, I find myself chuckling at the ridiculousness of trying to negotiate with a cat who can summon storms at will. There's a rhythm to this chaos now, a strange harmony between the absurd and the ordinary. Nimbus has claimed this suburban home as his kingdom, and I've become his loyal, if somewhat bewildered, subject. But this role reversal has gifted me something unexpected: joy. Joy in the unpredictability, in the moments when a sudden storm bursts from a sunny sky, or when Nimbus curls in my lap with a rare, contented purr. Even the bizarre rituals I once performed with trembling hands have become playful dances, a language of companionship spoken without words. Twilight finds us by the window, the sky a magnificent swirl of purples and pinks, painted by the tempest Nimbus conjured earlier this week. The notebook in my hand is filled with scribbles and sketches, notes on weather patterns, Latin phrases, and the odd behavioral quirk. But more than anything, it's a record of a journey from confusion to acceptance, from fear to laughter. Nimbus's green eyes sparkle with serene authority as I write, a silent promise that this chaos, this beautiful, unpredictable chaos, is here to stay. So yes, life with Nimbus is far from ordinary. It's a whirlwind of storms and whispers, rituals and ridiculousness. But it's also a story of companionship, of finding humor and warmth in the most unexpected places. And as I sit here, watching the rain dance on the window pane and Nimbus reign with unblinking eyes, I realize something important. Sometimes, the best way to live is to let go of control and embrace the chaos as normal. After all, isn't that where the real magic happens? The next flicker of the lamp catches Nimbus's gaze, and I smile. Whatever comes next, whatever storms or spells he has in store, I'm ready. Because in this house, under Nimbus's watchful eyes, chaos isn't the enemy, it's the heart of home. And just when I think I've finally settled into this new normal, a faint rumble rolls through the walls, and Nimbus lets out a low, satisfied purr. I glance outside to see a new, unexpected storm brewing on the horizon. Well, here we go again. Bring it on, Nimbus, I say with a grin. I'm all in. And with that, the cat that never blinks, and I prepare for whatever absurd adventure awaits us next. The cat that never blinks. At last, here we are. After 30 chapters, countless strange weather events, absurd rituals, and more Latin phrases than I ever thought I'd hear in a suburban home. The story of Nimbus and me reaches its curious, unblinking conclusion. It's ironic, really a cat that never blinks, and yet somehow I find myself blinking away tears of laughter and bewilderment as I sit here typing this final chapter. Nimbus, of course, remains exactly as he ever was: sleek black fur, piercing green eyes that refuse to close even for a moment, and a regal posture that makes every other cat I've ever met look like a bedraggled alley survivor. He's perched on the armrest of my battered old couch, tail flicking ever so slightly, watching me with a calm so profound it could unsettle a Zen master, or an ordinary suburban pet owner. It's funny how things change when you embrace the absurd. When Nimbus first arrived, I was skeptical, exhausted, and more than a little anxious about the strange Latin whispers and sudden indoor thunderstorms. Remember that. The rain pouring down from the ceiling like some kind of feline curse. I thought I was losing my mind. But now, sitting here in the twilight of this suburban evening, I realize that losing my mind might have been exactly what I needed. The day's light fades softly through the curtains, casting long shadows that dance with Nimbus's silent presence. Outside, a gentle rain taps rhythmically against the window pane, a sound that once might have sent me into a panic about weather patterns and cat-induced storms. Now it's just background music to the strange symphony of life we compose together. Maggie drops by, as she often does, her sharp eyes behind those glasses of hers flicking between Nimbus and me with a mixture of disbelief and amusement. Still talking to the cat in Leighton, she quips, plopping down beside me with her trademark sarcastic grin. I shrug, half smiling. He listens. Sometimes, Nimbus emits one of his rare, barely audible Latin mutterings, something about tempestuous quieter calm weather, I think, and Maggie raises an eyebrow, clearly considering whether to call a professional or just chalk this all up to my questionable sanity. We share a laugh, the kind that bubbles up from the absurdity of the situation and the warmth of an old friendship. Later, Jenkins pays one of his infamous visits, notebook clutched tightly like a talisman. His wild theories about Nimbus's origins, ranging from ancient weather gods to interdimensional feline overlords, are met with my half-grinned amusement and Nimbus's complete indifference. The cat stretches languidly on the windowsill, eyes tracking the raindrops as if orchestrating the world outside with a single unblinking stare. I listen, fascinated despite myself. Jenkins's passion, his obsession with the supernatural, adds a layer of mystery that I'd never fully appreciated until now. Maybe Nimbus isn't just a cat. Maybe he's something more. Or maybe he's a cat who's found the perfect way to keep a man on the edge of reason and laughter. As night settles, I find myself alone in the kitchen, the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional drip of rain the only sounds accompanying me. I sip my tea, feeling the warmth spread through my hands and into my chest. Nimbus sits nearby, his gaze fixed on the window, the unblinking eyes a steady beacon in the dim light. There's comfort in that gaze, a strange reassurance that beneath the chaos, the storms, and the Latin incantations, there's a bond that defies explanation. A friendship forged in absurdity, laughter, and the unpredictable dance of companionship. So what now? Do I try to unravel the mystery further? Do I continue to battle the storms and perform bizarre rituals?
Nah.
I think I'll just accept it. Accept Nimbus for what he is. A cat that never blinks, a master of chaos, a source of unending comedy and occasional affection. Life with Nimbus is unpredictable, utterly ridiculous, and strangely wonderful. And really, isn't that what companionship is all about? As I settle back on the couch, Nimbus curls up beside me, tail twitching with satisfaction. His green eyes never close, but they don't need to. We both know the world is a little stranger now, and that's perfectly fine by me, because sometimes the best kind of normal is a little bit crazy. And so the cat that never blinks rules my heart and home, a silent sovereign of storms and laughter, forever a hilarious mystery in this suburban life. But hey, if you ever need a weather forecast, just ask Nimbus. Just don't be surprised if the answer is in Latin. End of the story. Not quite. Just the beginning of a new chapter, one full of chaos, companionship, and the unblinking stare of a cat who knows far more than he lets on. And me. I wouldn't have it any other way.